You know, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, you know, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, you know, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com. And you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. It's the Mueller Report. This is we're starting with page 144 today. This is labeled Post-Election and Transition Period Contacts. That would be contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Trump was elected president on November 8, 2016. Beginning immediately after the election, individuals connected to the Russian government started contacting officials on the Trump campaign and transition team through multiple channels, sometimes through Russian Ambassador Kislyak and at other times through individuals who sought reliable contacts with U.S. persons not formally tied to the campaigners' transition team. The most senior levels of the Russian government encouraged these efforts. The transition did not establish that these efforts reflected or constituted coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia in its election interference activities. As soon as news broke that Trump had been elected president, Russian government officials and prominent Russian businessmen began trying to make inroads into the new administration. They appeared to not have pre-existing contacts and struggled to connect with senior officials around the president-elect. As explained below, those efforts entailed both official contacts through the Russian embassy in the United States and outreaches sanctioned at high levels of the Russian government through business rather than political contacts. A, page 145, A, outreach from the Russian government. At approximately 3 a.m. on election night, Trump campaign press secretary Hope Hicks received a telephone call on her personal cell phone from a person who sounded foreign but was calling from a number with a D.C. area code. Although Hicks had a hard time understanding the person, she could make out the words Putin call. Hicks told the caller to send her an email. The following morning, on November 9th, 2016, Sergei Kuznetsov, an official in the Russian embassy at the United States, emailed Hicks from his Gmail address with a subject line, message from Putin. Attached to the email was a message from Putin in both English and Russian, which Kuznetsov asked Hicks to convey to the president-elect. In the message, Putin offered his congratulations to Trump for his electoral victory, stating he looked forward to working with Trump on leading Russian-American relations out of crisis. Hicks forwarded the email to Kushner, asking, can you look into this? Don't want to get duped, but don't want to blow off Putin. Kushner stated in congressional testimony that he believed it would be possible to verify the authenticity of the forwarded email through the Russian ambassador, whom Kushner had previously met in April of 2016. Unable to recall the Russian ambassador's name, Kushner emailed Dmitry Simes of CNI, whom he had consulted previously about Russia, and asked, what is the name of the Russian ambassador? Kushner forwarded Simes's response, which identified Kislyak by name, to Hicks. After checking with Kushner to see what he had learned, Hicks conveyed Putin's letter to transition officials. 5 days later, on November 14, 2016, Trump and Putin spoke by phone in the presence of transition team members. including incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. B, high-level encouragement of contacts through alternative channels. As Russian officials in the United States reached out to the president-elect and his team, a number of Russian individuals working in the private sector began their own efforts to make contact. Peter Aven, a Russian national who heads Alfa Bank, Russia's largest commercial bank, described to the office interactions with Putin during this time period that might account for the flurry of Russian activity. Aven told the office that he is one of approximately 50 wealthy Russian businessmen who regularly meet with Putin in the Kremlin. These 50 are often referred to as the oligarchs. Aven told the office that he met on a quarterly basis with Putin, including in the fourth quarter of 2016, shortly after the U.S. presidential election. Aven said that he took these meetings seriously and understood that any suggestions or critiques that Putin made during these meetings were implicit directives and that there would be consequences for Aven if he did not follow through. As was typical, the 2016 fourth quarter meeting with Putin was preceded by a preparatory meeting with Putin's chief of staff, Anton Vaino. According to Aven, at his Q4 2016 one-on-one meeting with Putin, Putin raised the prospect that the United States would impose additional sanctions on Russian interests, including sanctions against Aven and/or Alfa Bank. Putin suggested that Aven needed to take steps to protect himself and Alfa Bank. Aven also testified that Putin spoke of the difficulty faced by the Russian government in getting in touch with the incoming Trump administration. According to Aven, Putin indicated that he did not know with whom formally to speak and generally did not know the people around the president-elect. Page 147. Aven, deleted by Bill Barr, told Putin that he would take steps to protect himself and the Alfa Bank shareholders from potential sanctions. And one of those steps would be to try to reach out to the incoming administration to establish a line of communication. Aven described Putin responding with skepticism about Aven's prospect for success. According to Aven, although Putin did not expressly direct him to reach out to the Trump transition team, Aven understood that Putin expected him to try to respond to the concerns he had raised. Aven's efforts are described in Volume 1. 2. Kirill Dmitriev's transition-era outreach to the incoming administration. Aven's description of his interactions with Putin is consistent with the behavior of Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian national who heads Russia's sovereign wealth fund and is closely connected to Putin. Dmitriev undertook efforts to meet members of the incoming Trump administration in the months after the election. Dmitriev asked a close business associate who worked for the United Arab Emirates Royal Court, George Nader, to introduce him to Trump transition officials, and Nader eventually arranged a meeting in the Seychelles between Dmitriev and Eric Prince, a Trump campaign supporter and an associate of Steve Bannon. It's the Mueller Report. It's the Mueller Report.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. New horrors from the Trump administration having to do with health care, having to do with the environment. We'll get into those as we continue through the program. In our second hour today, by the way, Michael Mann is going to drop by, the famed climate scientist and co-star of the new documentary Ice on Fire and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if star is the right way. Yeah, Michael's a star. Absolutely, Michael Mann is a star. And and we're going to get into a whole bunch of stuff. But I want to start out with the new horror that is awaiting us if the Republicans are successful in this case that's being heard today in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Actually, before I get to that, though, breaking news and a mind-boggling take on this. Ross Perot, 89 years old, died apparently yesterday or early today. It was reported this morning, first thing this morning, that he died at the age of 89 from leukemia that he's suffered apparently for 5 or 6 months. Although at the age of 89, pretty much whatever you die of is probably something, related to being that old. But although, I know a pretty sprightly 89-year-old actually right now. But in any case, my mother-in-law, who's just amazing, she's like the Energizer Bunny. But so I shouldn't sound ageist here. But in any case, I was watching MSNBC this morning, and they said they broke, breaking news: Ross Perot just died, and the person doing the news, as far as I recall, and maybe you recall this differently. If so, let me know. But rewrote history. I know, Ross Perot had a whole bunch of different campaign issues that he was concerned about, and one of them was the national debt. But the thing that he really was pumping, the thing that he was really outraged about, the thing that animated his candidacy, the thing that separated him from George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton in the 1992 election was that both Bush and Clinton supported NAFTA, the NAFTA agreement that Ronald Reagan had initiated and that had ultimately been, the final negotiation of it had happened during the George Herbert Walker Bush administration between 1988 and 1992. And so in 92, when both Bush and Clinton were saying we need NAFTA and we need more of these, so-called free trade agreements around the world, Ross Perot came out and said no. That's my recollection. But this morning on the news, all they said was he campaigned against the federal budget deficit and won, 19% of the vote. 18.9% of the vote. And then they played a clip of him, and they started the clip with him saying, if you're only in it for the money, you're going to hear this giant sucking sound from the South. Well, what does that have to do with the federal budget deficit? Absolutely nothing. And I'm yelling at the TV. In fact, as Nate sitting over here, he goes, Tom, we need to do a segment called Tom Watches TV. So often I'm yelling at it. So in the interest of correcting the record, I want to play a clip of Ross Perot, and this was, one of his debates with George Herbert Walker Bush, who was then president, and Bill Clinton, who successfully challenged him in the 1992 election and became president. Both Bush and Clinton supporting NAFTA. And here's what Ross Perot had to say. And I'm going to leave in the front part of this clip that NBC chose to clip out for reasons that I totally don't understand. Unless your recollection is different from mine, that Ross Perot was not campaigning on the issue of no more free trade deals, but instead was campaigning on pretty much solely on the issue of let's reduce the federal budget deficit, which, by the way, had gone up precipitously during the Reagan administration. It was only $800 billion when Reagan came into office. It was $2.4 trillion when Reagan left, which got Ross Perot pretty cranked up. But I just don't remember that was the core of his campaign, because George Herbert Walker Bush was also campaigning on reduce the federal budget deficit, and Bill Clinton tipped his hat to it. And in fact, Bill Clinton gave us, was only the second president since basically Nixon to have a balanced budget. The one before that was Jimmy Carter, both Democrats. But anyhow, here's what Ross Perot had to say.
Pay $1 an hour for your labor. Have no health care. That's the most expensive single element making a car. Have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south. So if the people send me to Washington, the first thing I'll do is study that 2,000-page agreement and make sure it's a two-way street.
There you go. And I think it started out, send your jobs to Mexico or something like that. There was quite a little riff there at the very beginning of it where he went through this at some length. So, you can find this on the internet. I mean, this is not hard to find. It's about a 2-minute clip, and it's really worth listening to because he just lays it out. He says, you want to outsource your jobs. You want to have, no wage controls. You're paying your people $1 an hour, no environmental controls, no labor standards, no retirement plan, et cetera, et cetera. And, this is what Perot ran on. Or am I remembering wrong? Am I rewriting history? I don't think I am. I think NBC did this morning, and I'm not sure why. Either they were being lazy. The producers are all, young'uns who don't remember the 1992 election. Or, well, we know that, some of these big corporations have a clear bias toward so-called free trade deals. So anyhow, there's that. Number two, Obamacare is going on trial today. This is a big deal. This is the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, a very conservative court. This is basically the southeastern district of the United States. And 2 of the 3 judges who are going to hear this case are Federalist Society members. Just like this judge who back in November of last year in, I believe it was in Texas, ruled that Obamacare is unconstitutional. Now, the rationale that they're using, and this was 20 states, 20 Republican-controlled states that sued collectively with the state of Texas. And so it's Texas versus United States is the case. These 20 states, these 20 Republican-controlled states, and then when Trump ran for president, he was supportive of this. When he became president, he was supportive of this. And these 20 states, the argument that they made is that the Obamacare's individual mandate, in other words, you must buy health insurance. The original argument they made was before the Supreme Court back, in 2012, was that mandate was unconstitutional. There's nowhere in the Constitution where it says that the government can force you to buy a product from a private company. So John Roberts split that baby in half in a 5-4 decision in which he said, no, that mandate is not actually a mandate. It's not actually requesting or requiring you to give money to a for-profit insurance company. It's actually a tax. And the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and elsewhere, clearly defines the ability of the government to lay taxes. And that was how they maintained the Affordable Care Act. That's how John Roberts avoided blowing it up. So then, in 2017, in Trump's tax cut legislation, because Trump hates Obamacare, right? He campaigned against it. He wants to take away, what little health insurance you have. He and the Republicans. I don't know if it was him, but the Republicans put into the tax cut legislation a provision that reduces the penalty for not buying, not buying insurance to zero. So the argument that the states are making now, today, in front of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals is a tax of zero is not a tax. And if you're still on the books, if the law is still requiring people to buy health insurance from private companies, A, that's definitely not a tax because there's no tax. It's the penalty has been reduced to zero. And B, if that part of the law has been invalidated, then under the Constitution, the entire law has to be invalidated. Now, that's a constitutional argument that's pretty sketchy. But, 2 out of the 3 judges are right-wing Republican appointees to the Federalist Society, which has been, championing this forever. The Federalist Society, heavily underwritten by right-wing libertarian billionaires who don't believe that Americans should have health insurance unless they pay for it themselves with the money that they inherited from daddy. So, and if they rule against Obamacare, or frankly, if they rule in favor of it, it's probably going to end up before the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court takes it, the decision's probably going to come down at the end of the 2020 term, which would be July of 2020, just 4 months before the election? 3 months before the election, 3.5 months before the election, which is just going to throw things into chaos, particularly if they blow up Obamacare. And what would happen? No more federal subsidies, which means that the Obamacare markets would collapse. So the cost of your health insurance is going to explode, number one. Number two, no more federal funding for Medicaid. Now, 3/4 of the states have now expanded Medicaid, so that people, the working poor, the Medicaid expansion is not for poor people. Those people already have Medicaid, making under $3,000 a year. It's for the people that make more than $3,000 and less than $15,000 a year, basically. It varies from state to state, but basically in that spectrum. In other words, the working poor, the minimum wage workers, they will suddenly lose their health insurance. And that's going to be something like 18 or 19 million people. And then the insurance companies will once again be able to put lifetime caps on the payouts if you get really sick. They will once again be able to kick you off your insurance policy if you get really sick. They'll be able to once again say, oh, well, you had cancer before, so if you want to have a health insurance policy now, it's going to cost you $25,000 a month rather than the $250 a month or whatever, $1,000 a month that we would charge normal people. So, keep an eye on this. It's going to get interesting here. There's a lot of different moving pieces happening all at once. And in our third hour, I'm going to get into in some detail, and I will share with you some of this in this hour as well. This whole thing with the climate crisis. I also want to tell you about guns. There's a new movement to get guns under control. We'll talk about that right after the break.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So how would it affect you if the Republicans are successful in blowing up Obamacare? And do you think that this is going to work for them politically? And welcome back. Stephen in Georgetown, Texas. Hey, Stephen, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's up?
I worked with, I lived in the Dallas area and towards the end of the 20th century, and I worked with Ross Perot's independent movement. And
Right, the Reform Party, wasn't it called?
Yes, eventually he did form a party, but basically he ran as an independent until he formed his party. And basically he was a very, very wealthy man who understood debt like very few other people did. But the problem he had mostly was what you said with the free trade agreements, which were not free trade agreements. And you picked the perfect clip because Ross Perot was concerned that the cost of responsibility was dropped when you move your factory south of the border.
Yeah.
And that was his main issue. The problem with the deficit, he had demonstrated over a lifetime of making a great deal of money from basically a business he started from nothing.
Yeah, he started with a $1,000 investment, EDS,
Yeah.
electronic something systems, yeah.
Yeah, electronic data system.
EDS, that's right, yeah.
And then he went on to be bought by General Motors. But the man was, to look at him, you would not know that he was worth 10 digits.
Right.
And he was just an honorable businessman. He said a handshake was a good, his handshake was his contract.
Right.
Because he was as good as what came out of his mouth.
Yep.
But yeah, he was worried because when you go south of the border, all these charges for responsibility for retirement, for employee safety, for the environment, they're gone. And, in Mexico, they might have had some regulation on all those programs, but they were basically nod, nod, wink, wink type programs because if you paid the right people at the time, it was still PRI Mexico, and they owned the government. They could be bought.
Right.
And they would allow companies to move down, treat workers badly, build substandard plants, and the cost of responsibility would be thrown out, and pollution, and it was just a bad deal. When it has to be multiple hundred pages long, free trade requires that the other side take your product while you take some of their product. But in order to take product from us, you have to have somebody who can afford to buy it.
Right.
At the time,
And Mexico didn't have that, yeah.
Was not a progressive economy and did not have a lot of market.
My recollection of the way that Bush and Clinton were both selling it was that by building factories in Mexico, A, we don't need those manufacturing jobs here in the United States because we're moving toward a service economy. Everybody's going to be a computer programmer, A. But B, if we build factories, if American companies build factories in Mexico and those factories pay well, then that will create a Mexican middle class. That Mexican middle class will then want to buy products made in the United States, and that will increase manufacturing in the United States, which will make up for the loss of manufacturing going to Mexico. It was a complete fantasy. It was as much BS as Reagan's trickle-down economics, but that was their sales pitch.
Well, and some companies, even before the trade agreement, did do that. And I'm not going to name any because I have stock in some of the companies that did build it.
Okay. Stephen, I got to wrap it up. I'm sorry, we're running out of time here, but thank you for the call. And great to hear from somebody who actually knew Ross Perot and worked with him. We'll be back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Hey, there's a new petition over at rootsaction.org. It's a little hard to find right off their homepage, so we put a link to it on our Facebook page, the Thom Hartmann Program Facebook page. And it's a petition based on my new book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. And here's how it reads. With the support of Thom Hartmann, author of The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment, we encourage you, this is a petition to Congress, right? We encourage you to enact these solutions for guns that have been long useful for cars. 1, require a registration and title for every gun. 2, require a license based on a written and shooting range test. 3, require gun owners to carry liability insurance. In addition, we demand that semi-automatic weapons be restricted under the same laws as automatic weapons. It started this as a do-it-yourself petition. It's been sent to the governor of at least one state. Guns, they note, are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States. Guns kill about 34,000 people in the United States. Actually, it's 40,000 last year, 2/3 of those being suicides. Countries with reasonable gun laws don't have the same level of gun violence that we do here in the United States. So if you want to see that petition, you can see it over at rootsaction.org and check it out. Obamacare going back on trial. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to mention, Tom Steyer's jumping into the race. And, he's a billionaire. We're talking about Ross Perot. Ross Perot, we just, a fellow just called a few minutes ago who from Texas, who had Ross Perot's accent, in fact, and said that he worked with Ross Perot or worked with, the people who worked with Ross Perot. And he said, he was as good as his handshake. His handshake was as good as a contract. What he said you could take to the bank. He started his company, EDS, Electronic Data Systems, with $1,000 and sold it to General Motors for billions. And, said, yeah, his whole thing was the trade agreements. And that's what it was all about. Well, so anyhow, we had that billionaire back in 92. Will Tom Steyer be that billionaire this time around or not? I mean, we saw, Howard Schultz of Starbucks coffee fame jump into the Democratic race and then basically say that he was only in the Democratic race to try to push back against people who were too liberal. And pretty soon, the people who were too liberal got Howard Schultz out of the race. I mean, he couldn't take the heat. I don't honestly know what Tom Steyer's positions are, other than that he wants Trump impeached, which is a fine position, great starting point. But what does he think about Medicare for all? What does he think about a Green New Deal? What does he think about, free college? What does he think about, what's his plan for dealing with $1.5 trillion in student debt? Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they both have plans for all of these things, as do many of the other candidates. What are you going to do about, can you undo or repeal the 2005 bankruptcy law that makes it illegal for people with college debt to repeal that in bankruptcy, for example? There's just, I don't know the answer to these questions with regard to Tom Steyer's position. And I'm not even sure, I think that there's so much blowback against billionaires that it might really bite him. There's this study that was put together back in 1989 by James Stimson. He's a professor at UNC, and it's called The Public Policy Mood. It's updated every 2 years, and it has accurately predicted every presidential election, basically since Kennedy and Johnson, with the single exception of Trump. And you and I both know Trump didn't actually win the election, so therefore. And he says that the current public mood on policies like taxation, government spending, environmental regulation. He said it's the most liberal, I'm quoting, he says the annual estimate for 2018 is the most liberal ever recorded in the 67-year history of the mood, higher than the previous high point of 1961. He said this is where the electorate is. It's like the time of Kennedy and Johnson. Voters are going to respond more warmly to policies from the left. So where's Tom Steyer in this? What do you think about it? How do you think it's going to play out?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And apropos of the whole discussion of, free trade agreements and Steyer and Perot and all that, also I want to share some economic news with you right after the break. And we'll be picking up your phone calls. It's the Mueller report. This is we're starting with page 144 today. This is labeled post-election and transition period contacts. That would be contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Trump was elected president on November 8, 2016. Beginning immediately after the election, individuals connected to the Russian government started contacting officials on the Trump campaign and transition team through multiple channels, sometimes through Russian Ambassador Kislyak and at other times through individuals who sought reliable contacts with U.S. persons not formally tied to the campaigners' transition team. The most senior levels of the Russian government encouraged these efforts. The transition did not establish that these efforts reflected or constituted coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia in its election interference activities. As soon as news broke that Trump had been elected president, Russian government officials and prominent Russian businessmen began trying to make inroads into the new administration. They appeared to not have pre-existing contacts and struggled to connect with senior officials around the president-elect. As explained below, those efforts entailed both official contacts through the Russian embassy in the United States and outreaches sanctioned at high levels of the Russian government through business rather than political contacts. A, page 145, A, outreach from the Russian government. At approximately 3 a.m. on election night, Trump campaign press secretary Hope Hicks received a telephone call on her personal cell phone from a person who sounded foreign but was calling from a number with a D.C. area code. Although Hicks had a hard time understanding the person, she could make out the words Putin call. Hicks told the caller to send her an email. The following morning, on November 9th, 2016, Sergei Kuznetsov, an official in the Russian embassy at the United States, emailed Hicks from his Gmail address with a subject line, message from Putin. Attached to the email was a message from Putin in both English and Russian, which Kuznetsov asked Hicks to convey to the president-elect. In the message, Putin offered his congratulations to Trump for his electoral victory, stating he looked forward to working with Trump on leading Russian-American relations out of crisis. Hicks forwarded the email to Kushner, asking, can you look into this? Don't want to get duped, but don't want to blow off Putin. Kushner stated in congressional testimony that he believed it would be possible to verify the authenticity of the forwarded email through the Russian ambassador, whom Kushner had previously met in April of 2016. Unable to recall the Russian ambassador's name, Kushner emailed Dmitry Simes of CNI, whom he had consulted previously about Russia, and asked, what is the name of the Russian ambassador? Kushner forwarded Simes's response, which identified Kislyak by name, to Hicks. After checking with Kushner to see what he had learned, Hicks conveyed Putin's letter to transition officials. 5 days later, on November 14, 2016, Trump and Putin spoke by phone in the presence of transition team members, including incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. B, high-level encouragement of contacts through alternative channels. As Russian officials in the United States reached out to the president-elect and his team, a number of Russian individuals working in the private sector began their own efforts to make contact. Peter Aven, a Russian national who heads Alfa Bank, Russia's largest commercial bank, described to the office interactions with Putin during this time period that might account for the flurry of Russian activity. Aven told the office that he is one of approximately 50 wealthy Russian businessmen who regularly meet with Putin in the Kremlin. These 50 are often referred to as the oligarchs. Aven told the office that he met on a quarterly basis with Putin, including in the fourth quarter of 2016, shortly after the U.S. presidential election. Aven said that he took these meetings seriously and understood that any suggestions or critiques that Putin made during these meetings were implicit directives and that there would be consequences for Aven if he did not follow through. As was typical, the 2016 fourth quarter meeting with Putin was preceded by a preparatory meeting with Putin's chief of staff, Anton Vaino. According to Aven, at his Q4 2016 one-on-one meeting with Putin, Putin raised the prospect that the United States would impose additional sanctions on Russian interests, including sanctions against Aven and/or Alfa Bank. Putin suggested that Aven needed to take steps to protect himself and Alfa Bank. Aven also testified that Putin spoke of the difficulty faced by the Russian government in getting in touch with the incoming Trump administration. According to Aven, Putin indicated that he did not know with whom formally to speak and generally did not know the people around the president-elect. Page 147. Aven, deleted by Bill Barr, told Putin that he would take steps to protect himself and the Alfa Bank shareholders from potential sanctions. And one of those steps would be to try to reach out to the incoming administration to establish a line of communication. Aven described Putin responding with skepticism about Aven's prospect for success. According to Aven, although Putin did not expressly direct him to reach out to the Trump transition team, Avin understood that Putin expected him to try to respond to the concerns he had raised. Avin's efforts are described in Volume 1. 2. Kirill Dmitriev's transition-era outreach to the incoming administration. Avin's description of his interactions with Putin is consistent with the behavior of Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian national who heads Russia's sovereign wealth fund and is closely connected to Putin. Dmitriev undertook efforts to meet members of the incoming Trump administration in the months after the election. Dmitriev asked a close business associate who worked for the United Arab Emirates Royal Court, George Nader, to introduce him to Trump transition officials, and Nader eventually arranged a meeting in the Seychelles between Dmitriev and Eric Prince, a Trump campaign supporter and an associate of Steve Bannon. It's the Mueller Report.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
That's Nate. And welcome back. We're back. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, and oh, wait a minute. No, that's not Nate. That's me. I've got audio playing from something. Oh, it's from Twitter. Holy cow. It's the debate with Al Gore is what's playing. Somebody had it on Twitter. Sorry about that. Okay, welcome back. Let's see here. Michael in Ojai, California. Hey, Michael, thanks for listening to KPFK. What's up? Michael?
Hi, Tom.
Hey.
I just want to say I'm such a huge fan of yours. But
thank you, Michael.
To get to the point, I'm a gay man in my 60s, and I'm from a very staunch Mormon family. And recently, you've been talking about, can we forgive people that have gone over to the Trump supporting?
Oh, this was one of our questions for yesterday that we really never got to, and I think you're the first caller on that issue. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say, Michael. Forgive my interrupting you.
Well, I've really been struggling with it, Tom, in a very direct way, because the people I love the most have gone, my mother, who I've formed my entire personality over, has gone over to support a man who grabs women's genitals, and it blows my mind that her mind has been polluted by Fox News. But to get to the point that I'd like to make, Tom, I don't believe that this could happen if we had a country where more people had access to higher education. I'm someone who educated very late in life at age 45, and I remember the difference in my self-esteem that occurred when I achieved my master's degree. And I would like to suggest that the reason that your show is so popular and the reason that your listeners love you as much as they do is because you are educating us, and you have never, ever looked down or been condescending toward those of us who are not educated.
Well, as a guy who got kicked out of high school and college, I got kicked out of high school for publishing an underground newspaper, and because they suspected I was smoking pot. I got kicked out of college for being arrested in a SDS riot, basically, among other things. It's hard to look down on people who don't have an education. Go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry I interrupted you again.
What I'd like to suggest, Tom, is that this would not be happening if our population was educated more. And I think that we would be very well advised to begin to offer bachelor's level, master's level, and PhD to every citizen in our country.
Yeah,
we have the technology to do this for the first time in history. And I believe that we need to move education out of the hands of the elite. I am someone who suffers under a great deal of student debt because of my educating late in life, and I was in a car accident and lost control of my loans. But I know that my education has been worth it in terms of what it has done for my personal sense of self-esteem. And I believe that if more people had access to education, they would be more thoughtful. And those of us who have our education, we need to not be looking down our patrician noses at those of us, at the rest of the people who have not been as fortunate as us to achieve their higher education.
Very well said, Michael. We are the only developed country in the world. Of the 34 OECD countries, in 33 of them, there is virtually no student debt. In some cases, if somebody wants to go on to a graduate level degree, maybe. But in most cases, there certainly is no student loan debt crisis in any of those other countries. Louise and I visited Costa Rica a couple of years ago. In fact, it was for filming. It was filming for the Janine Benyus segment of the Ice on Fire movie, the new movie that I'm in and that Leo DiCaprio narrates and George DiCaprio produced. And the cab driver who picked us up at the airport and drove us out to the jungle, like a 2-hour drive out to where we went, was telling us along the way, we were like, what do you like about living in Costa Rica? And he says, well, we have free health care and we have free college. He said, I'm a cab driver and 2 of my kids now have advanced graduate degrees. And I'm like, wow, how do you do that? And he says, well, the country just decided that was a priority. They don't have a military, or they don't have an army in Costa Rica. They do have some military services, but and he said, we just put our money into these things. And the experience that my father had, if you go back and look at our parents' generation, Michael, my father and my wife's father both went to college on the GI Bill. My dad didn't graduate because Mom got pregnant with me and he dropped out and went to work in a steel mill to get her through that and all that kind of stuff. But Louise's dad graduated, got his law degree, paid for fully by the federal government, and became the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Michigan. And what we know from that experience is that, from the GI Bill experience, is that for every $1 that the United States of America invested in educating the roughly million young men who had come back from World War II and took advantage of the GI Bill, for every $1 that we invested in them, over their lifetimes, they paid an additional $7 to the federal government in taxes because they had higher earnings than people who are not college graduates. So for every dollar invested in college education by a government, and this is what every other government in the world knows, and that and Republicans don't want us to know, for every dollar invested, we make $7 back as a country. And that doesn't even begin to measure the impact of having an educated workforce. We had, because of the GI Bill, we had one of the most educated populaces. We also weren't in ruins like Europe was. We had one of the most educated populaces in the world in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which is why we led the world in innovation, why we put a man on the moon, why we invented Velcro and transistors and integrated circuits and revolutionized the world and everything. This all came out of, directly or indirectly, the GI Bill. So, Michael, you are absolutely right. And this is being on the right side of political history. We've got, the Democratic Party now. We've got this study, from this Professor James Stimson of UNC saying that right now the American electorate is more liberal than the electorate that elected Jack Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson, with that electorate, got past Medicare and Medicaid. So, anyhow.
Tom, I'm a psychotherapist by trade, and I believe that we're all suffering from a collective PTSD.
Yeah.
I want to remind everyone that while we're being distracted by this clown car presidency, what we could be doing is we could be finding new and innovative ways to care for each other. And I think there are many of us out there. This border thing has just made all of us who have a conscience, it's just really pushed us to the edge.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the time is coming when we're just going to have to surround the system with our bodies and with our morals and stop it cold. And I really believe that education for every citizen of the United States is the answer to our economic problems and to our political problems. And if we were able to manifest this, Tom, we would never look back. And I hope that you take your leadership position and continue to do what you're doing with this show and open up education for everyone.
Thank you, Michael. It's my plan to do it until I croak. We'll see if things intercede, but I appreciate that. Michael, thank you for the call. Thanks for listening to KPFK, a great powerhouse station, a huge, the largest FM west of the Mississippi out of Los Angeles. Jared in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. Hey, Jared, what's on your mind?
There's so much on my mind, I don't even know where to really start, so I'm going to just swing it this time.
Well, let's start with a single topic.
Okay, you mentioned something about billionaires and how Americans despise billionaires, and that's fairly true. I mean, if you think about it,
I think we had a love affair with them during the Reagan years, and now we're falling out of love with them. I mean, Steve Jobs was, everybody's favorite person. Ross Perot was much beloved. I mean, there was a time when billionaires were celebrated, but I think that the Koch network, what we've seen is kind of the ugly face of the billionaires, the greed, the me, no, you can't have that health insurance because I don't want my taxes to go up, that stuff.
Well, they're so out of touch with society. I mean, if you look at people like Trump or like Epstein, they're just in their own, society itself, cut off from average, everyday people. Like, laws don't matter to them. They don't have to work for anything. They've never really worked in their entire lives. I mean, when people attack Trump and saying he's not a billionaire, do people realize no, him being a billionaire is actually a good thing, and we should promote it because people don't like average billionaires. Yeah. They like it because he has a celebrity status.
And that's what made him president. Yeah, Jared, thank you for the call. It's spot on. Marta in Big Bear Lake, California. Hey, Marta, you wanted to get back to Ross Perot. I find this an absolutely fascinating topic, and I'm wondering if anybody saw the Perot announcement on CNN. I just caught it on MSNBC, and is CNN similarly trying to whitewash Perot's outspoken opposition to so-called free trade agreements?
Well, I was on the Ross Perot campaign as far as being, one of many, many people that was out on the street corners and, walking the streets, talking to people, passing out flyers. Of course, there was no Facebook. And what I clearly remember was him talking about of course, about NAFTA and the incredible job losses that were going to happen.
Right.
But he also linked that to corporate lobbyists running the halls of Congress, buying up our democracy. I remember that phrase. It's just deeply embedded in my mind. I remember him talking about General Motors and how Japan was taking over the automotive industry, not because of anything wrong with the workers. In fact, he went to the GM plant and was talking to the guys on the floor making the cars who had great ideas for innovation, but the CEOs were up in their, oak-paneled dining rooms on the, 50th floor, not listening to the workers. So it was hurting innovation, and I don't remember him talking a lot about that. And I also remember that he wanted the people to be part of, putting in their own money. I don't remember him just dumping his own money, unlike what people say.
Right.
So then came the WTO and, the Battle of Seattle, hundreds of thousands of young people.
Yeah, this is in 99 or 2000, thereabouts.
And then Bill Clinton, Secretary of Commerce, was flying Fortune 500 CEOs to Asian countries and to help them relocate. And he actually got indicted, I believe, for actually selling seats on the planes. And then I remember what happened to Chiapas, Mexico, and, just developing a deep compassion for those people because how NAFTA destroyed their, communal land system. And all of this, the dots were connected for me. Mm-hmm. Coming out of the S&L crisis, I lost 60% of my income in 1 month.
Whoa.
So people were involved. It was democracy. It wasn't just coming from the top down.
Yeah, and Ross Perot, apparently, my memory is correct, at least according to two callers. Thank you, Marta, for that. Ross Perot was actually basically calling out, both Clinton and Bush for wanting this. Mark in Delta Junction, Alaska. Mark, we just have a minute to the break. You got a quick one?
Oh, geez, I don't, Tom. This is a personal story about.
Okay, let me
Ross
put you on
Perot
hold then. Let me put you on hold, and we'll pick you up on the other side of the break. In fact, I'm not even going to, because we're running out of time here. But if you're just tuning in, the question that essentially I was asking is, do you remember this differently than I do? My recollection is that Ross Perot ran in 1992 against free trade agreements, specifically NAFTA. And what the television told me this morning was that Ross Perot ran against government debt. And I'm not sure why they're reinventing him, unless they like free trade agreements or something.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
So what's your recollection? And we'll check in with Mark in about 4 minutes and get his story. Stick around. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Tim in the Southside Alabama. Tim, thanks for listening to us. What's up?
Hey, Tom, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it sort of sounds like you're in the bathroom, but it's okay.
Anyway, I remember Ross Perot, and I was quite fascinated by him. He was one of those bigger-than-life type of people. But I think his personality sometimes kind of outshined him to where it was hard to listen to what he was saying because he was so colorful. But
he was irascible. I mean, he lost campaign. I remember people leaving his campaign. I'm talking about the senior staff because he wouldn't take their advice, and these were consultants and whatnot. He wouldn't take their advice, and he kept just coming up with. I mean, he would come up with an idea and be running with it before his staff even could catch up with him, and it just really upset a few of them.
Yeah, he was that way. But there was two things. Yes, I remember it the way you do. That I remember him in the giant sucking sound and all of that. But the other thing that he did somewhere along the line that, of course, earned him the label of being somewhat of a nut was he said something about the Republican dirty trick squad trying to disrupt his daughter's wedding.
That's right. Yeah.
And in the years since, on Maddow and very believable programs, sure enough, if you dig around, there were people like Lee Atwater and Karl Rove, who's still alive, and Roger Ailes, who literally had people do nothing but try to find dirt on people and to make them look silly.
Right.
So Ross kind of tipped it off. I mean, you also had Hillary, who mentioned the vast right-wing conspiracy. So,
but that was a few years later.
Maybe he wasn't as crazy as people thought he was.
Oh, I think he was crazy like a fox. I mean, you don't take $1,000 investment and turn it into $1 billion corporation if you don't have something and some fundamental knowledge of how things are working. And I mean, there's a lot to be said for being in the right place at the right time with the right idea and all that kind of stuff. But apparently he made the mistake, and I've seen so many people make this mistake of believing his own PR, of thinking that he really was the answer to the world's problems. And in fact, he had an answer to a problem that was being proposed, frankly, by both political parties, although it originated in the Republican Party, originated in the Reagan presidency, which was NAFTA, and which then became kind of the foundation stone for all these other free trade agreements. And
well,
go ahead.
It just goes to show that CEOs are not always as smart as people try to make them out to be.
Well, things have changed, Tim. The average CEO, back when Ross Perot was running, the average CEO had been with his own company, and they were usually his, for over 30 years. Now the average CEO has been with the company for less than 5 years. The average CEO back, before the Reagan era, climbed their way up from the bottom or even started the company. Today, the average CEO, now we have a CEO class, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's a whole different thing. It's just a
they just go from one place to another, and sometimes they don't even know a thing about the industry that they're in charge of.
Right. They're just, in many cases, they're just sociopaths willing to destroy workers' lives or steal their pensions. I mean, that's what it boils down to. Tim, thanks for the call. I'm sorry we're hitting the break here. We're going to get back to Mark's story in just a minute about Ross Perot. We'll be right back. It's 52 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. 52 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Mark in Delta Junction, Alaska. Let's try it again, Mark. What's up?
Okay, Tom, thanks. Yeah, I'm that retired school teacher up here in Alaska. Mm-hmm. In the 80s, I was teaching school in Venezuela at an international school. I came back to Alaska, and then in the 90s, I went to Southeast Asia and taught at Rumruti International in Bangkok, Thailand. Mm-hmm. I met my wife. We adopted an 8-year-old Thai girl, our daughter. And we were running into difficulty in the late 90s trying to get her to the United States. We'd done all the paperwork. We paid all the fees. And we couldn't understand why the government was giving us a tough time. My mother and father, who had relocated to Texas, my mom was a Ross Perot fan. Mm-hmm. She called him and said, you know, my son is having all this difficulty trying to get his adopted daughter to the States. Can you help? And to our surprise, he called her on a regular basis, then got in contact with me and used his offices to help us get our daughter to the States. Wow. Primarily because he had an employee like me who had worked overseas, adopted in the Philippines, and was having the same kind of trouble with our government getting this paperwork processed and getting the kid to the States. So Perot, we got back to the States in 97, and Perot invited us up to his office in Dallas, so we got to meet him. And he got to meet my wife and daughter, of course. Wow. My daughter graduated from the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and has an excellent job working in stocks and annuities outside of Seattle. Mm. It wouldn't have happened except for him. Wow. But here's the import of the story. While I was in his office with the secretary, waiting for him to get done with his meeting so we could meet and have lunch together, the secretary said, your story is not uncommon. He has done this behind-the-scenes stuff time and time again, and he never seeks any notoriety for it. But he does these things. And, of course, we were certainly appreciative. But this is just a little bit of what goes on or what went on behind the scenes with Ross Perot. So, he was a man of his word, and we certainly respect him, and we're sorry to hear of his passing. We kept exchanging Christmas cards over the years since 97. And when I was teaching in Oregon, a little tiny school outside of Salem, they told me that for my English as a second language students, mostly illegal Mexicans, they couldn't afford computers. And just as a note, I sent him and said, hey, this is what's going on in the States. The next thing I knew, a couple of weeks later, the secretary comes running down to my classroom and says, there is a delivery outside for you. I said, for me? She said, yeah, these huge boxes. And it turned out to be computers he had donated to the school for my ESL illegal Mexican kids. Wow. So I just wanted to get that out there. This guy wasn't just political. I mean, he was real personable and did what he said he was going to do.
That is an extraordinary story, Mark. It really is. And my recollection is, again, in 1992, that he was campaigning for president on a policy of no more NAFTA, keep jobs in the United States, help out American workers. Does your memory comport with that, or were you not?
It does. It does exactly.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Mark. Great talking to you. And thanks for sharing that story. That is fascinating. That's absolutely fabulous. We'll be back. Michael Mann is going to join us, the world-famous climate scientist. We're going to be talking about the latest horrors in the climate situation around the world, and some hope right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
You know, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, you know, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, you know, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com and you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. It's the Mueller Report. This is we're starting with page 144 today. This is labeled Post-Election and Transition Period Contacts. That would be contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Trump was elected president on November 8, 2016. Beginning immediately after the election, individuals connected to the Russian government started contacting officials on the Trump campaign and transition team through multiple channels, sometimes through Russian Ambassador Kislyak and at other times through individuals who sought reliable contacts with U.S. persons not formally tied to the campaigners' transition team. The most senior levels of the Russian government encouraged these efforts. The transition did not establish that these efforts reflected or constituted coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia in its election interference activities. As soon as news broke that Trump had been elected president, Russian government officials and prominent Russian businessmen began trying to make inroads into the new administration. They appeared to not have pre-existing contacts and struggled to connect with senior officials around the president-elect. As explained below, those efforts entailed both official contacts through the Russian embassy in the United States and outreaches sanctioned at high levels of the Russian government through business rather than political contacts. Page 145A, outreach from the Russian government. At approximately 3 a.m. on election night, Trump campaign press secretary Hope Hicks received a telephone call on her personal cell phone from a person who sounded foreign but was calling from a number with a D.C. area code. Although Hicks had a hard time understanding the person, she could make out the words Putin call. Hicks told the caller to send her an email. The following morning, on November 9th, 2016, Sergei Kuznetsov, an official in the Russian embassy at the United States, emailed Hicks from his Gmail address with the subject line, message from Putin. Attached to the email was a message from Putin in both English and Russian, which Kuznetsov asked Hicks to convey to the president-elect. In the message, Putin offered his congratulations to Trump for his electoral victory, stating he looked forward to working with Trump on leading Russian-American relations out of crisis. Hicks forwarded the email to Kushner, asking, can you look into this? Don't want to get duped, but don't want to blow off Putin. Kushner stated in congressional testimony that he believed it would be possible to verify the authenticity of the forwarded email through the Russian ambassador, whom Kushner had previously met in April of 2016. Unable to recall the Russian ambassador's name, Kushner emailed Dmitry Simes of CNI, whom he had consulted previously about Russia, and asked, what is the name of the Russian ambassador? Kushner forwarded Simes's response, which identified Kislyak by name, to Hicks. After checking with Kushner to see what he had learned, Hicks conveyed Putin's letter to transition officials. 5 days later, on November 14, 2016, Trump and Putin spoke by phone in the presence of transition team members, including incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. B, high-level encouragement of contacts through alternative channels. As Russian officials in the United States reached out to the president-elect and his team, a number of Russian individuals working in the private sector began their own efforts to make contact. Peter Aven, a Russian national who heads Alfa Bank, Russia's largest commercial bank, described to the office interactions with Putin during this time period that might account for the flurry of Russian activity. Aven told the office that he is one of approximately 50 wealthy Russian businessmen who regularly meet with Putin in the Kremlin. These 50 are often referred to as the oligarchs. Aven told the office that he met on a quarterly basis with Putin, including in the fourth quarter of 2016, shortly after the U.S. presidential election. Aven said that he took these meetings seriously and understood that any suggestions or critiques that Putin made during these meetings were implicit directives and that there would be consequences for Aven if he did not follow through. As was typical, the 2016 fourth quarter meeting with Putin was preceded by a preparatory meeting with Putin's chief of staff, Anton Vaino. According to Avin, at his Q4 2016 one-on-one meeting with Putin, Putin raised the prospect that the United States would impose additional sanctions on Russian interests, including sanctions against Avin and/or Alfa Bank. Putin suggested that Avin needed to take steps to protect himself and Alfa Bank. Avin also testified that Putin spoke of the difficulty faced by the Russian government in getting in touch with the incoming Trump administration. According to Avin, Putin indicated that he did not know with whom formally to speak and generally did not know the people around the president-elect. Page 147. Avin, deleted by Bill Barr, told Putin that he would take steps to protect himself and the Alfa Bank shareholders from potential sanctions. And one of those steps would be to try to reach out to the incoming administration to establish a line of communication. Avin described Putin responding with skepticism about Avin's prospect for success. According to Avin, although Putin did not expressly direct him to reach out to the Trump transition team, Avin understood that Putin expected him to try to respond to the concerns he had raised. Avin's efforts are described in Volume 1. 2. Kirill Dmitriev's transition-era outreach to the incoming administration. Avin's description of his interactions with Putin is consistent with the behavior of Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian national who heads Russia's sovereign wealth fund and is closely connected to Putin. Dmitriev undertook efforts to meet members of the incoming Trump administration in the months after the election. Dmitriev asked a close business associate who worked for the United Arab Emirates Royal Court, George Nader, to introduce him to Trump transition officials, and Nader eventually arranged a meeting in the Seychelles between Dmitriev and Eric Prince, a Trump campaign supporter and an associate of Steve Bannon. It's the Mueller Report.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
The Mueller office that he had said to Kalanick that the plan was crazy. It's the Mueller Report.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. By the way, check out our free one-hour podcast. It's the Hartmann Report, we call it. It's on iTunes and every place else. And find out if the Trump crisis presents an opportunity for progressives on the current podcast. We'll be talking about all this stuff, but you can check it out. And you'll also find on our podcast, no doubt, Dr. Michael Mann, who is our next guest. He's the Distinguished Professor of Meteorology and the Director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State University, and the recipient of this year's essentially the Nobel Prize for the Environment. It's called the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. He's the author of several books, most recently The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. His website, michaelmann.net. And you can tweet him. He's on Twitter. I don't have his Twitter handle right here in front of me, but I just retweeted him this morning, so you can easily find that. Dr. Mann, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. It's Michael E. Mann at Twitter, and it's great to be back with you.
Thank you very much. The climate crisis coming. We have Anchorage, 90 degrees. Today, this one of the many things that press conference is being held. In fact, I think it has already happened with Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Earl Blumenauer. Earlier today, or maybe it will be happening shortly. I'm missing page 2 of the press release and that's where it says when. But basically, they're calling for they're introducing a resolution in Congress calling for the United States to declare a climate emergency, as has New York City has done. Over 700 governments in 16 countries have done so. What is the state of our climate right now, and how does what's going on in Alaska and the massive droughts that are happening, this 5-year drought down in Honduras and Nicaragua, which are driving refugees to our southern border, how do these things relate to climate as opposed to weather?
Yeah, so indeed, in a very real sense, we are seeing a climate emergency. The fact is that we are now witnessing truly dangerous impacts of climate change on our everyday lives. The extreme weather events that we're seeing around the world over the past several years, and this summer here in the United States, and elsewhere around the Northern Hemisphere. Once again, unprecedented wildfires and floods and heat waves are a reminder that the climate crisis has arrived, and it's an emergency in the sense that we are not acting to the extent necessary to avert ever worsening impacts of climate change. We have to do far more. We have to get off the burning of fossil fuels. We need to move toward renewable energy. And here in the United States, of course, we're going in the wrong direction under the current administration, under the Trump administration, which in fact is dismantling the progress that we had made in recent years.
Yeah, I'm a member of AAAS, and so I get Science, and I get their newsletter, and I subscribe to Nature, and I don't recall which of those two publications this was in earlier this week, but a rather extensive article suggesting that if we just had a worldwide effort at planting trees in areas where it's actually quite easy to plant trees, that could suck up as much as a third of all the carbon that has been introduced into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. Am I remembering that right? Are you familiar with that report?
I did see that study and the widespread news reports, some of which, in fact, exaggerated the conclusions of that study. Mm-hmm. It's important to keep these studies in context. Rarely is there one study that comes out and dramatically changes our understanding. This latest study is just another study in a whole series of studies in recent years that demonstrate that there is the potential to take some of the carbon that we are pumping into the atmosphere back out of the atmosphere through reforestation and other means. But here's the thing, that conclusion that we've heard repeated, that trees could take up to 1/3 of the carbon pollution we're putting into the atmosphere, that's based on the rosiest of assumptions. Essentially, it assumes that just about every possible square area, square meter of land around the world is used for reforestation, that we basically take all the available land that might need to be used for agriculture and other purposes and assign it to, and reforest that land. And so that is probably an exaggerated estimate of how much reforestation we could do. My guess is that you probably have to cut that figure in half or maybe in thirds. Maybe we're really only talking in practice in terms of what we could practically do, uptaking about 10% of the carbon pollution we're putting into the atmosphere. What that means is that this is not a panacea. This is not the silver bullet. This will help out a little bit, and everything we do can help out a little bit. But ultimately, if we do not dramatically lower our burning of fossil fuels, if we do not rapidly move away from a fossil fuel-driven economy, there's no amount of reforestation or natural carbon capture that is going to prevent the ever increasing levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the ever worsening impacts of climate change.
We're seeing the Arctic melting right now. I mean, to the point that, excuse me, I had to sneeze, to the point that, countries are starting to fight over who has shipping lanes and things like that. I mean, literally, we're seeing the Arctic melting. And it's obviously, you and I have had this conversation for several years now, how it's affecting our weather and things like that. But, there's also this concern that as the permafrost melts, it releases enormous amounts of carbon in the form of both methane and carbon dioxide, that there are carbon stores, clathrates and whatnot in the Arctic. At what point, and then we're seeing Anchorage at 90 degrees, is passing the tipping point in that part of the world in a way that is irrevocable and could be, radically destructive. Is that one of the major tipping points that the IPCC is pointing to when they said, I think it was a year or two ago, that we had 10 to 12 years basically to get this thing under control?
Yeah, so first of all, one of the impacts of climate change is actually a spread in allergies. And so I'm not going to blame climate change on your sneeze.
It may well be.
That is one of the impacts of climate change, human health impacts, including more widespread allergies.
Yeah, this is the first time in my life that I've started sneezing, when the trees are flowering and things. Anyhow, back to you.
Well, there you go. I'm not going to say it proves the point, But seriously, you talked about some of the wider implications of, if we exceed the typically cited level of about 1.5 degrees Celsius warming of the planet, that number that you cited, the 12-year number, basically, how long do we have to decrease carbon emissions by a factor of 2? How long do we have to do that before we commit to, catastrophic levels of warming, 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius warming? And basically, we've got to lower them by between 5 and 10% a year for the next decade and beyond. And so that ties into this 12-year number. Otherwise, we warm the planet more than 1.5 degrees Celsius and pretty soon more than 2 degrees Celsius. There are tipping points that lie out there, and some of them we may have passed. We may have warmed the oceans enough and destabilized the ice shelves of Antarctica enough to eventually lock in not just feet, but meters of sea level rise, 20 feet of sea level rise. We may be very close, if not having already passed that no return, where we guarantee massive flooding of the world's coastlines. And if we're lucky, even if we do guarantee that, it happens over centuries, and so we can slowly adapt and retreat to those changes. If we're unlucky, it could happen quite a bit faster. Now, there are other tipping points that have been discussed that do relate directly to Arctic warming. There's a lot of methane that's stored in the Arctic in the permafrost in the form of what's known as clathrate, and we know that if there's enough warming of the Arctic, the melting of the permafrost, that methane could be released into the atmosphere, and methane is an even more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So it's what we refer to as an aggravating feedback. It can add to the warming. There's no evidence yet. The science doesn't support the notion that we're close to a tipping point where such massive amounts of methane will be released that it will overwhelm the warming effect of the CO2 that is arising in the atmosphere because of the burning of fossil fuels. So the first order effect, and we have to keep our eye on the ball here, is the continued burning of fossil fuels, the elevation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the warming that's creating. But there are potential exacerbating feedbacks, and the Arctic in particular is a region that's warming faster than the rest of the planet because of the melting of ice and more absorption of the incoming sunlight. It's another one of those aggravating feedbacks. The Arctic warms faster than the rest of the planet. That means we're seeing impacts up there long before we're going to see those same impacts down here. It's a harbinger of what we can expect, that record heat. Baked Alaska, as I referred to it on Twitter, this record heat in Alaska is indicative of what's to come and what's already happening down here in the lower 48. And one other thing, when you warm the Arctic and you melt the ice, it turns out there's an increasing evidence now, scientific evidence, that can change the jet stream. It can change it in a way that gives us those stuck weather patterns like we've seen last summer and this summer, those very persistent high pressure and low pressure systems that just won't move along. And so you get unprecedented heat, drought, and wildfire out west, or back here, back east, unprecedented amounts of rainfall when you're stuck under one of those low pressure centers. And those highs and lows get larger and they get stuck in place. And that's a linkage we increasingly understand actually relates to the melting of the ice up in the Arctic. What happens in the Arctic, as we like to say, doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's impacting us down here.
And I think the first time you and I had a conversation about this, there was a woman who was not a climate scientist who had made this proposal. She was a mathematician, as I recall, and it was about 5 or 6 years ago. And we were both, correct me if I'm wrong, at least I was like, oh, this is a novel theory. And now it seems to have been proven.
Yeah, well, some of the early work in this area was done by Jennifer Francis of Rutgers, and I forget what her actual background is, but certainly her work, she was sort of at the leading edge of pointing out these connections in sort of a heuristic manner. And over time, what's happened is there's been quite a bit of detailed science that backs her up. She appears to have been prescient in that regard.
Absolutely brilliant. Dr. Michael Mann, great seeing you. Thank you so much for dropping by. Great to see you in Ice on Fire. And keep up the great work, sir. You're a real hero for all of us.
Same to you, my friend.
Thank you, Michael. Good talking with you. Dr. Michael Mann. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
MichaelMann.net, M-A-N-N is how he spells his name, and Michael E. Mann on Twitter. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Let's pick up some phone calls here. We've been talking about Ross Perot in this previous hour. We've been talking about the climate. We've been talking about health care. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff on the table here. And so, we'll continue with these conversations as well as, if anybody wants to talk about the climate. Tamara in Carl Junction, Missouri. Hey, Tamara, you're on the air.
Well, hello, Tom. I worked for Ross Perot for both his presidential runs because he ran twice.
Right. The second time was 96, wasn't it?
Yes, against Clinton again.
Yep.
And he was a small guy, but he was bigger than life. I got to meet him in Arizona, and, he flew, and the reason I worked for him, because I remembered as a teenager on TV watching him fly POW wives to Vietnam with supplies for the prisoners.
Oh, that's right. He was huge on the POW issue back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, yeah.
Yes, and then in 79, when two of his EDS executives were arrested in Iran, he went to Iran to the prison to tell them he was going to get them out, and he had hired a special forces colonel who was retired, and they were going to go in and get them. But a few days later, the Shah fell, and the people overran the prison, and they got the men out and brought them home.
Wow.
I mean, and that's what I remembered about Ross Perot, and that's why I voted for him both times. And he won, if you recall, the first time, he won Missouri and Arizona electoral college votes.
In 92? I didn't think he had any electoral college votes. That's.
Yeah, he had 19% of the vote.
Oh, I know that. He got 18.9% of the vote, almost 20%. I mean, in fact, the last independent candidate to do that was Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president for 8 years, or for 7 years. And, after he left the Republican Party in 1908, I think it was, or 1912, and he started the Bull Moose Party. And he pulled somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% also. But I mean, that, none of us are old enough to remember that. So
not bad for a kid that started his life out delivering newspapers on the back of a horse.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot for the story, Tamara. Great to hear from you. Jim in Lone Tree, Colorado, you've got a different perspective on Ross Perot. Tell me about it.
Yeah, haven't we learned anything about putting a businessman in charge of the country?
Well, I'm not suggesting that Ross Perot should be or should have been president. I've actually voted for Bill Clinton in 92, but back to you.
Well, he was a spoiler because he took away the votes from Bush, and so Clinton got in.
Well, that's the argument that the Republicans make. Now, Democrats to this day are saying that he took votes away from Clinton, and Clinton would have had a much larger victory had it not been for Ross Perot. Both Bush and Clinton were in favor of NAFTA, and that was Perot's principal thing, if my memory is correct. So I think he took votes, frankly, from both of them.
Fine. Well, my father, I asked him about him. He's the second highest ranking sergeant major in the Army, and I asked him about him, and he said, GD Nazi, he fires his people when they get AIDS.
Yeah. Oh, geez. I didn't know about that. Okay, thank you for that. Jim, we'll be right back. Every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com and you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. A couple of other things I want to add just to kind of reset and revisit. We've been talking about the climate emergency and some things I want to add to that actually first, and then I'll get into some of these other topics. Number one, an amazing piece published over at the NBCnews.com website. It's reporting done collaboratively between NBC News and Inside Climate News, based out of El Rosario, Honduras, a rural town in Honduras. The reporters write, last year, farmers here watched helplessly as drought withered their corn and bean crops for the 5th straight year. With nothing to sell and no food supplies to feed their families, they've entered this growing season without any reserves. El Rosario, this is the town, is on the edge of hunger. This dry corridor, they write, which stretches from southern Mexico to Panama and includes about half of Honduras, has seen some years with up to 40% less rain than normal, interspersed with years of heavy rainfall that washes out crops. So they're going back and forth between drought and flood, which is what's happening in the American Midwest, by the way, as well. The Honduran agriculture industry employs 1/3 of the population of Honduras, and it's being wiped out. And this is climate change. Make no mistake about it. As Michael Mann was just laying out, it absolutely is climate change. So what is Donald Trump doing about this? He's lying through his teeth. He held a press conference yesterday, or a meeting or whatever, with his former coal industry lobbyist, who now is the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Andrew Wheeler. His EPA guy is a former coal lobbyist. His interior guy, our public lands, is a former oil lobbyist. And what happened was apparently some Republican consultants on the Trump reelection team did some polling, and they discovered that if Trump wants to get back even the white female vote, which 53% of which went for him in the last election, that he's way down in that he's got to speak up about the environment. So he talked for almost an hour, and as the New York Times noted, it was riddled with lies, half-truths, and deliberately misleading statements. Donald Trump has allowed more dumping of mining waste into streams and rivers. He has revoked the Clean Power Plan. This, by the way, is from a brilliant piece Mark Sumner did over at Daily Kos. Just one of the best writers out there. Revoked the Clean Power Plan provisions against emissions of particulates, sent the EPA to court to fight against its own rules on heavy metals from power plants, overturned rules on the release of methane gases, and kept pesticides on the market known to cause breast cancer. And all that was just in his first 6 months. So, it's hurting him in the polls. So he comes out, he says, we've got the cleanest air, we've got crystal clean water. And these are lies. These are just lies. We don't have the cleanest air in the world, not even close. At the same time that Trump was speaking, the American Lung Association was filing a lawsuit over the destruction of public health. It's incredible.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
In fact, Trump put into effect the biggest rollback in clean water regulations since the Clean Water Act went into effect. I think that was Nixon, wasn't it? It's the Mueller report. This is we're starting with page 144 today. This is labeled post-election and transition period contacts. That would be contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Trump was elected president on November 8, 2016. Beginning immediately after the election, individuals connected to the Russian government started contacting officials on the Trump campaign and transition team through multiple channels, sometimes through Russian Ambassador Kislyak and at other times through individuals who sought reliable contacts with U.S. persons not formally tied to the campaigners' transition team. The most senior levels of the Russian government encouraged these efforts. The transition did not establish that these efforts reflected or constituted coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia in its election interference activities. As soon as news broke that Trump had been elected president, Russian government officials and prominent Russian businessmen began trying to make inroads into the new administration. They appeared to not have pre-existing contacts and struggled to connect with senior officials around the president-elect. As explained below, those efforts entailed both official contacts through the Russian embassy in the United States and outreaches sanctioned at high levels of the Russian government through business rather than political contacts. A, page 145, A, outreach from the Russian government. At approximately 3 a.m. on election night, Trump campaign press secretary Hope Hicks received a telephone call on her personal cell phone from a person who sounded foreign but was calling from a number with a D.C. area code. Although Hicks had a hard time understanding the person, she could make out the words Putin call. Hicks told the caller to send her an email. The following morning, on November 9th, 2016, Sergei Kuznetsov, an official in the Russian embassy at the United States, emailed Hicks from his Gmail address with a subject line message from Putin. Attached to the email was a message from Putin in both English and Russian, which Kuznetsov asked Hicks to convey to the president-elect. In the message, Putin offered his congratulations to Trump for his electoral victory, stating he looked forward to working with Trump on leading Russian-American relations out of crisis. Hicks forwarded the email to Kushner, asking, "Can you look into this? Don't want to get duped, but don't want to blow off Putin." Kushner stated in congressional testimony that he believed it would be possible to verify the authenticity of the forwarded email through the Russian ambassador, whom Kushner had previously met in April of 2016. Unable to recall the Russian ambassador's name, Kushner emailed Dmitry Simes of CNI, whom he had consulted previously about Russia, and asked, "What is the name of the Russian ambassador?" Kushner forwarded Simes's response, which identified Kislyak by name, to Hicks. After checking with Kushner to see what he had learned, Hicks conveyed Putin's letter to transition officials. 5 days later, on November 14, 2016, Trump and Putin spoke by phone in the presence of transition team members, including incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. B, high-level encouragement of contacts through alternative channels. As Russian officials in the United States reached out to the president-elect and his team, a number of Russian individuals working in the private sector began their own efforts to make contact. Peter Avan, a Russian national who heads Alfa Bank, Russia's largest commercial bank, described to the office interactions with Putin during this time period that might account for the flurry of Russian activity. Avan told the office that he is one of approximately 50 wealthy Russian businessmen who regularly meet with Putin in the Kremlin. These 50 are often referred to as the oligarchs. Avan told the office that he met on a quarterly basis with Putin, including in the fourth quarter of 2016, shortly after the U.S. presidential election. Avan said that he took these meetings seriously and understood that any suggestions or critiques that Putin made during these meetings were implicit directives and that there would be consequences for Avan if he did not follow through. As was typical, the 2016 fourth quarter meeting with Putin was preceded by a preparatory meeting with Putin's chief of staff, Anton Vaino. According to Avan, at his Q4 2016 one-on-one meeting with Putin, Putin raised the prospect that the United States would impose additional sanctions on Russian interests, including sanctions against Avan and/or Alfa Bank. Putin suggested that Avan needed to take steps to protect himself and Alfa Bank. Avan also testified that Putin spoke of the difficulty faced by the Russian government in getting in touch with the incoming Trump administration. According to Avan, Putin indicated that he did not know with whom formally to speak and generally did not know the people around the president-elect. Page 147. Avan, deleted by Bill Barr, told Putin that he would take steps to protect himself and the Alfa Bank shareholders from potential sanctions. And one of those steps would be to try to reach out to the incoming administration to establish a line of communication. Avan described Putin responding with skepticism about Avan's prospect for success. According to Avan, although Putin did not expressly direct him to reach out to the Trump transition team, Avan understood that Putin expected him to try to respond to the concerns he had raised. Avan's efforts are described in Volume 1. 2. Kirill Dmitriev's transition-era outreach to the incoming administration. Avin's description of his interactions with Putin is consistent with the behavior of Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian national who heads Russia's sovereign wealth fund and is closely connected to Putin. Dmitriev undertook efforts to meet members of the incoming Trump administration in the months after the election. Dmitriev asked a close business associate who worked for the United Arab Emirates Royal Court, George Nader, to introduce him to Trump transition officials, and Nader eventually arranged a meeting in the Seychelles between Dmitriev and Eric Prince, a Trump campaign supporter and an associate of Steve Bannon. It's the Mueller Report.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
So as you probably know, we do special, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com. And you get signed up for the newsletter.
Welcome back, Thom Hartmann here with you. A lot of
So
topics, on our
whatever you call it, on our list for the day, is starting out, and this is where I started in the first hour of the program, an hour and a half ago, was the idea that, well, not the idea, the reality that right now the Trump administration is fighting against itself, essentially, in court before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They are saying that because Obamacare, the only rationale that John Roberts could come up with to save Obamacare back in 2012 was to say that the individual mandate was a tax, and the Constitution authorizes Congress to tax, and therefore Obamacare was constitutional. Well, in 2017, in the tax cut, the Republicans built into that a provision that eliminated the individual mandate fee, which was the tax that John Roberts was pointing to. Used to be, you had to pay $100 a year or something like that if you didn't have health insurance. And Roberts said that's a tax. So now they're going back to court. The 20 Republican-controlled states and the Trump administration, they're going back to court now before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And if this goes to the Supreme Court, it'll come out next year in the summer, just before the election. And they're saying you need to tear down all of Obamacare because the tax is no longer there. We did away with the tax, and the tax was the basis for saying that Obamacare was constitutional. And so therefore, you need to just destroy the whole thing and go back to a world where the insurance companies, if you get sick, they can simply cancel your insurance policy. If you've been sick in the past, they can refuse to write a policy for you or quote you obscene prices. They can play games with which doctors you can see and which ones you can't, and all this kind of stuff. You can have lifetime caps again, so that if you have an expensive condition or a chronic condition, the insurance companies can cut you off or simply refuse to insure you in the first place. So we've got that. We've talked about that. We've been talking about climate change and that crisis and how Trump is lying through his teeth on that. I'll give you a little more information on that in our third hour. And Ross Perot just died at 89, and the news report I saw this morning said he was known for championing his opposition to the federal debt. And my recollection is, no, he was known for saying NAFTA was a bad deal. We'll get to that as we continue, too. But anyhow, let's pick up some of your phone calls here. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Paul. What's up?
Are you there?
I am.
Okay.
You sound your phone sounds a little faint, but otherwise all's good. Let's go for it.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. Well, the business about it not being a tax with respect to Obamacare, and therefore that throws it out this is a reducto absurdum because for if it's no longer a tax, so neither is there a mandate.
Right.
So that doesn't make the law unconstitutional. And to say that John Roberts, the only thing he could come up with was that it was a tax. Well, no, there's something much deeper here. And I don't know if you've come across this in your book on the Supreme Court, but there was something in a 1938 case called United States versus Caroline Products Corporation, a footnote, probably the most famous footnote in constitutional law, called footnote 4. And what it talked about was presumed constitutionality with regard to congressional legislation regarding economic regulations. So what he was presuming was that in order for it to be constitutional, it was a tax. And if you're going to say, oh, it wasn't a tax, it was a penalty, and that's not constitutional, that is not in keeping with footnote 4. And if people think, well, what is this all about? Actually, in 2013, as I was just prepping for my remarks on this topic, I saw an article in the New Yorker that Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited footnote 4. Actually, she talked about it, and she didn't cite it in her opinion, but she cited the case of Caroline Products in having to do with her dissent in another case about whether colleges can take race into consideration for admissions.
Right.
So this is an important concept. But what she said in this article is, in the past generation, and it's particularly within the Roberts Court, they've essentially thrown out footnote 4, and the effect has been to essentially to politicize the court, because footnote 4 is probably the only thing that describes when the court should consider something unconstitutional or when it should be considered constitutional. Strict scrutiny was suggested in footnote 4 when it comes to basic rights and laws that discriminate. So there was two edges to that sword. But what I wanted to say was that with regard to Obamacare, here's the problem with it. It's still the same old private insurance-based system. It really didn't change anything. So we're no closer to a single-payer system under Obamacare than we were before Obamacare. As a matter of fact, this is what people need to understand. Obamacare was passed in 2010 and implemented in 2013, but this was the Republican plan that Chuck Grassley and Orrin Hatch submitted in 1993 to oppose Hillary Care. Hillary Care was supposed to be more or less a single-payer system.
And this is, by the way, what Mitt Romney did as governor of Massachusetts.
That's right.
It's called Romney Care.
What the Republican plan was called HART, Health, Equity, and Access Reform Today Act, with the acronym HART, was written by Milton Friedman out of the Heritage Institute in 1989. So, in other words, we are living under what the Republican plan is. And if people want to think it's a failure, then that's the best we can do under a private insurance-based system.
Yep.
So if they're going to throw it away, okay, maybe it's going to have to hurt. When we have people who want to be as absurd as Donald Trump and what we have, then maybe we do have to start over. And when we start over with, throughout your pre-existing conditions and all that, and Tom, you have to realize the insurance companies wanted nothing to do with health insurance until the rules started getting written in their favor.
Right.
That's when they started saying that, okay, now we're interested. But until then, they never wanted anything to do with it. They didn't think it made sense. They didn't think there was any reason for it until you started writing rules in their favor. So maybe we do have to start over because, like I said, we're no closer to a single-payer system, and that might have to come, as in Canada, state to state or province to province. But we're no closer to it under Obamacare than we were before Obamacare.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I was not making the administration's argument. I was pointing out what their argument was. And I'm sure you got that nuance. And I think politically, the politically consequential thing about this is that actually there is a way that Obamacare or Romney Care or HART can transition into a public plan rather than a private plan, and that's having the public option so that people can choose to buy Medicare. But the assault on Medicare right now is unrelenting. They just announced, my health insurance company just notified me that starting at the beginning of next year, you can no longer buy Medigap plans that do away with the minimum deductible when you go to the doctor or for X-rays or for lab tests. In other words, absolutely everything is going to start costing you money if you're on Medicare if you can't buy these Plans F and Plan C. And that won't affect me because I'm grandfathered in, or anybody else who's on Medicare before the end of this year. But people who join Medicare starting next year, it's going to be much more expensive to have traditional Medicare, which is 2/3 of everybody. And all those deductibles will go away if you buy a Medicare Advantage plan, which is the privatized plans where the private insurance companies can cut you off if they choose to. They can tightly, and not just can, actually do tightly regulate which doctors you can go to. You have in-plan and out-of-plan. I mean, these are privatized policies. Most people don't even realize that they've bought a privatized policy. They think that they're still on Medicare because it's called Medicare Advantage. And this was rolled out in 2003 by the Bush administration as a way to destroy Medicare.
Did you know that Washington State is starting a public option beginning in 2021?
That's great. And see, if California were to go single payer, I think that would be, and there's talk about that, serious talk about that. I think, and Gavin Newsom, I know I believe is in favor of that. That would be the Saskatchewan. It was Saskatchewan who went first, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I did a website. It's not online yet. It's offline, but I did a web. What am I trying to say? Accessibility testing with the website. They won't. I saw the website, and I mean, I can't tell you what it's still in progress.
It's for Washington State's public option.
Yes.
Yeah.
I tested it for. They wanted some blind people to test it and see if the website works. And find bugs in it, which I did.
That's great. That's great. Paul, I got to run. We're hitting a hard break here. Thank you very much for the call and for pointing all that out. And yeah, I mean, this might present an extraordinary political opportunity for us if Trump gets what he wants, which is the destruction of Obamacare, because he's got nothing to replace it with. And we do. Or it could be a disaster for millions of people who right now, or who will lose their health insurance.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Or both. I suppose the outcome doesn't necessarily have to be binary. We're going to check in with Talk Media News in about 4 minutes. Stick around. And welcome back. Greg in Las Vegas. Hey, Greg, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, this is Greg in Las Vegas. My topic has been covered by a couple other people in the meantime. I voted for Ross Perot in the early 90s because of his opposition to NAFTA, and that was very clear to me. And then also in 1969, I was on board the airplane of POW wives and families that went to Paris, the charter plane that was paid for by Ross Perot, because my dad was missing in action in Vietnam. And I just wanted to share that because it's just another story of his philanthropy.
Yes.
And so in any case, beyond that, I was just reading in the U.S. Constitution, because of all this controversy around the term of the president, if Trump decides to stay on, well, he can't, because in the Constitution it's described as a term of 4 years. A term has an ending, a beginning and an ending.
Right.
So anyway, that's what I have to share, Tom.
Well, that was a good one, Greg. I'm curious, and feel free to tell me it's none of my business. It's personal, but I'm curious if they ever found your father's remains, or how that story ended.
Unfortunately, no. It's been a source of a real thorn in my family's side for all these years.
Yeah.
And it's I would not wish that on anyone. And it would be a relief on some level to know, but as certainly for many years now, we've just assumed that my dad was perished, either as a prisoner or when his airplane was shot down.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a lot of tragedy.
These are the costs of war that for example, George W. Bush didn't seem to take into consideration when he got us into Afghanistan and Iraq. Donald Trump doesn't seem to be considering when he talks about war with Iran.
It drives me crazy, Tom. It just drives me crazy. And I grew up certainly with surrounded by military people. My dad was a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base when I was a child. And he was asked if he wanted to become an astronaut. He turned it down because they call it. I remember the pilots would consider that the astronauts to be spam in a can. And
to be what? Greg, your phone goes in and out here. They consider.
Oh, sorry. The test pilots called the astronauts spam in a can.
Oh. Right.
Which is their morbid sense.
Which got kind of morbid after what's his name got cooked in the capsule.
Yeah, very sad, very sad. And but these growing up with all these military guys, I certainly when I was in college, I was voting Republican, but no more. I can't go there.
Yeah.
So. In any case, Tom, I've been listening to your show for a long time, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for calling in today and sharing your story with us, and thanks for watching us there on Free Speech TV in Las Vegas. We'll be right back. We're going to check in with Luke Vargas with Talk Media News in just a moment. Stick around. Every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com. And you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Quip.com/Tom. Welcome back. Let's check in with Luke Vargas with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Loving What You Do, Ellen Ratner's new book. Luke is the chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News, joins us today from New York. You can follow him on Twitter at The Courier. And Luke, the FP, I'm not sure what that is reporting that
Foreign policy, yeah.
Foreign policy, okay, thank you, is reporting that France and the UK will deploy more troops to Syria to offset withdrawing American forces. France and the UK, the European countries are getting into Syria as we're getting out of Syria. What's going on here? And Syria is, allies with Russia. I mean, this has a huge potential to be very, very messy, at the very least, does it not?
Yeah, and I think given a lot of the developments we've been seeing around Europe, from the detention of this Iranian vessel that was reportedly going to Syria, detained by the UK Navy several days ago at Gibraltar, between all these decisions around how to try and keep the Iran nuclear deal alive, and the role that these European countries, Germany, France, and the UK, have in sort of deciding the fate of that. I think there's a lot of tendency here to interpret this news about the Syria deployment as part of that bigger picture. I'm not sure it's necessarily so interlinked here. Basically, we're learning from the U.S. that we're going down from about 1,000 troops in Syria, we think, to about 400 by the end of the year, and that this is not a huge number of troops to make up. But Britain and France, as of today, according to Foreign Policy, have decided to try and make up the difference there. And it's, again, worth remembering here that in the Syrian conflicts, basically from the beginning, these countries have been right with us. They didn't deploy troops on quite the same level, but they have engaged in airstrikes with us. They've had ground troops in those areas in northeastern Syria. They consider the relationship with Kurdish groups in that region who have been really instrumental in pushing back ISIS to be important for their own national security here. And so, and I'd say given the intense cooperation we've seen between the U.S. and France and the U.K. in the Syrian conflict thus far, it's not surprising to see they're willing to go along with us here. But it is, I think, raising some justifiable questions about whether the UK is, in particular, bandwagoning with the United States on the bigger Iran policy, which I think is the big conversation to be having this week. With that oil tanker, with the decision in the next few days, we're predicting possibly for the UK maybe to be the first country to trigger the dispute resolution mechanism of the Iran nuclear deal, which would basically set a 2-month countdown to the possible actually sort of extermination of the Iran nuclear deal. Is Great Britain in this Syria action doing a little more than possibly the surface shows? Are they basically closing the policy gap with the United States on the broader Mideast policy? That's, I think, a big question that we have to keep asking ourselves.
I don't have a map in front of me. I'm sorry. Is northeastern Syria? My recollection, my understanding of this whole situation was basically that there was, what used to be, or what the Kurds have always wanted to be, part of Greater Kurdistan. That there's Kurds in Syria. This was the largely Kurdish region. Yep. That it was overrun by ISIS. That we helped take it back, or the Kurds fought them back with some help from us, and that our troops are there basically to provide protection for the Kurds, and that we've staked out this corner of Syria. A, is that an accurate recollection / understanding, and B, what does that have to do with Iran?
Well, yeah, I think your geographical familiarity with the crisis seems sort of on point, that you have, if you want to break down Syria into thirds, and they're not all equal territory, you have sort of the southwestern third is controlled by the Assad government at this point. The northwestern, it's really more like an eighth of the country, is very contested. That's where most of the fighting is. That's where Russia and Turkey are overlapping. And then there's sort of third off to the northeast, bordering Turkey on one side and Iraq on the other side, is pretty much held by the Kurds. And that is where the U.S. and our coalition forces have been sort of backed up into. We've decided to get out of some of the hairier areas where we're really coming in contact with the Russians, and it's probably for the better. So we're there. And I think a part of how it possibly ties in with Iran is you hear arguments from the Brits and others, particularly from the Americans, that a reason to stay there, in addition to helping out our Kurdish allies, is to prevent the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and its proxies from taking over that area. Now, I say there's definitely been exaggerated claims about an Iranian land bridge, but I would also say that is a corridor that I think many members of the anti-ISIS coalition realizes will be filled, at least to a degree, by proxy groups that are much less inclined to follow Western interests in that country if they do cede the area. So I think that's a reason why these countries feel the need to be there. And given the number of captured ISIS fighters there as well, I think there's an argument that you are hearing in Britain and France in particular that we need to keep our troops there to prevent, foreign fighters from returning back to Western Europe from that region in particular. So, a few more hundred troops from France and the United Kingdom in that context, not really so crazy at the end of the day.
Yeah, remarkable stuff. And we just have, 10 seconds. What's the latest out of Hong Kong?
The extradition bill has been temporarily stopped, but is not fully withdrawn. That's a kind of a cop-out answer from Hong Kong's government. I wouldn't expect street protests there to stop.
Yeah. Okay, that's a fascinating insight. Luke Vargas with Talk Media News. You can follow him on Twitter at The Courier. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you.
Great talking with you. We'll be back. We're going to continue our conversations about our petition for gun control, the new horrors awaiting us if the Republican Party is successful in health care. What will that mean to you? The climate crisis. Trump is lying through his teeth about that. I'll give you a little more detail on that. And Ross Perot, is the media whitewashing his memory?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
It's the Mueller report. This is we're starting with page 144 today. This is labeled post-election and transition period contacts. That would be contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Trump was elected president on November 8, 2016. Beginning immediately after the election, individuals connected to the Russian government started contacting officials on the Trump campaign and transition team through multiple channels, sometimes through Russian Ambassador Kislyak and at other times through individuals who sought reliable contacts with U.S. persons not formally tied to the campaigners' transition team. The most senior levels of the Russian government encouraged these efforts. The transition did not establish that these efforts reflected or constituted coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia in its election interference activities. As soon as news broke that Trump had been elected president, Russian government officials and prominent Russian businessmen began trying to make inroads into the new administration. They appeared to not have pre-existing contacts and struggled to connect with senior officials around the president-elect. As explained below, those efforts entailed both official contacts through the Russian embassy in the United States and outreaches sanctioned at high levels of the Russian government through business rather than political contacts. Page 145A, outreach from the Russian government. At approximately 3 a.m. on election night, Trump campaign press secretary Hope Hicks received a telephone call on her personal cell phone from a person who sounded foreign but was calling from a number with a D.C. area code. Although Hicks had a hard time understanding the person, she could make out the words Putin call. Hicks told the caller to send her an email. The following morning, on November 9th, 2016, Sergei Kuznetsov, an official in the Russian embassy at the United States, emailed Hicks from his Gmail address with a subject line, message from Putin. Attached to the email was a message from Putin in both English and Russian, which Kuznetsov asked Hicks to convey to the president-elect. In the message, Putin offered his congratulations to Trump for his electoral victory, stating he looked forward to working with Trump on leading Russian-American relations out of crisis. Hicks forwarded the email to Kushner, asking, can you look into this? Don't want to get duped, but don't want to blow off Putin. Kushner stated in congressional testimony that he believed it would be possible to verify the authenticity of the forwarded email through the Russian ambassador, whom Kushner had previously met in April of 2016. Unable to recall the Russian ambassador's name, Kushner emailed Dmitry Simes of CNI, whom he had consulted previously about Russia, and asked, what is the name of the Russian ambassador? Kushner forwarded Simes's response, which identified Kislyak by name, to Hicks. After checking with Kushner to see what he had learned, Hicks conveyed Putin's letter to transition officials. 5 days later, on November 14, 2016, Trump and Putin spoke by phone in the presence of transition team members, including incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. B, high-level encouragement of contacts through alternative channels. As Russian officials in the United States reached out to the president-elect and his team, a number of Russian individuals working in the private sector began their own efforts to make contact. Peter Aven, a Russian national who heads Alfa Bank, Russia's largest commercial bank, described to the office interactions with Putin during this time period that might account for the flurry of Russian activity. Aven told the office that he is one of approximately 50 wealthy Russian businessmen who regularly meet with Putin in the Kremlin. These 50 are often referred to as the oligarchs. Aven told the office that he met on a quarterly basis with Putin, including in the fourth quarter of 2016, shortly after the U.S. presidential election. Aven said that he took these meetings seriously and understood that any suggestions or critiques that Putin made during these meetings were implicit directives and that there would be consequences for Aven if he did not follow through. As was typical, the 2016 fourth quarter meeting with Putin was preceded by a preparatory meeting with Putin's chief of staff, Anton Vaino. According to Aven, at his Q4 2016 one-on-one meeting with Putin, Putin raised the prospect that the United States would impose additional sanctions on Russian interests, including sanctions against Aven and/or Alfa Bank. Putin suggested that Aven needed to take steps to protect himself and Alfa Bank. Aven also testified that Putin spoke of the difficulty faced by the Russian government in getting in touch with the incoming Trump administration. According to Aven, Putin indicated that he did not know with whom formally to speak and generally did not know the people around the president-elect. Page 147. Aven, deleted by Bill Barr, told Putin that he would take steps to protect himself and the Alfa Bank shareholders from potential sanctions. And one of those steps would be to try to reach out to the incoming administration to establish a line of communication. Aven described Putin responding with skepticism about Aven's prospect for success. According to Aven, although Putin did not expressly direct him to reach out to the Trump transition team, Avin understood that Putin expected him to try to respond to the concerns he had raised. Avin's efforts are described in Volume 1. 2. Kirill Dmitriev's transition-era outreach to the incoming administration. Avin's description of his interactions with Putin is consistent with the behavior of Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian national who heads Russia's sovereign wealth fund and is closely connected to Putin. Dmitriev undertook efforts to meet members of the incoming Trump administration in the months after the election. Dmitriev asked a close business associate who worked for the United Arab Emirates Royal Court, George Nader, to introduce him to Trump transition officials, and Nader eventually arranged a meeting in the Seychelles between Dmitriev and Eric Prince, a Trump campaign supporter and an associate of Steve Bannon. It's the Mueller Report.
You know, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell the list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com and you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
He had said to Kalimnik.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. A lot on our plate here. Just to recap some of the things we've been talking about, and we can continue to talk about. The climate emergency rolls on. In particular, and this is the part that it just is so frustrating to me that the media is not discussing this. We have gone from literally just 5 years ago, 1% of the people showing up at our southern border had children with them, to last year, 50% had children with them. Why is that? Well, it turns out that the main reason why is because the Golden Triangle, or the Triangle, whatever it's called, these countries in Central America are in an area that's being totally whacked by climate change, to the point that for 5 years they've been in a drought, and when the drought is episodically relieved, it's relieved by torrential downpours. They're getting in Central America what we're getting all over North America, which is actually happening all over the world, which is these weather systems are getting stuck, as Michael Mann was talking about in our last hour. The climate scientists, these weather systems get stuck, and so what would normally be just a couple of nice sunny days becomes a month-long drought, and what would normally be a couple of rainy days becomes a 2-week-long flood. And, it's wiping out these farmers, and, a third of the Honduran economy is agriculture. And these people are literally fleeing for their life. They're fleeing starvation, or in the places where the economy has been really, really badly damaged. What's stepping in to that vacuum, the political vacuum around that, and the economic vacuum, are the gangs. And so, they're fleeing violence as a consequence of that. So there's that. And Donald Trump, of course, lying through his teeth about it. His staff, or his campaign rather, this is absolutely hysterical, or it would be if it wasn't so tragic. Mark Sumner wrote just a brilliant op-ed about this over at Daily Kos. Donald Trump yesterday or the day before, it was reported yesterday, I saw it on the news, he was talking about how we've got the cleanest water ever, the cleanest air ever, crystal clear water, we're doing more, well, this hour-long rant of his
was just filled with lies. As Mark Sumner writes, Trump allowed more dumping of mining waste into streams and rivers. He revoked the Clean Power Plan provisions against emissions of particulates. That's the soot in the air, the stuff that causes cancer and emphysema and all kinds of things. He sent the EPA to court to fight against its own rules on heavy metals from power plants, heavy metals that cause cancer and poison us and destroy little kids' brains. He overturned the release of the rules on the release of methane gas. Methane gas, one of the most potent of the greenhouse gases out there. Trump kept pesticides on the market known to cause breast cancer. Turns out that if he wants to retain a 53% vote with white women, which is what he got last time, he's going to have to step up on the environment because white women are concerned about the environment, and this is what his campaign told him. So what does Trump do? He goes out on TV with his coal lobbyist EPA director, former coal lobbyist, and of course his interior director is the former oil lobbyist. He goes out on TV with these guys and lies, just lies through his teeth. He has overseen the biggest rollback of clean water regulations since the Clean Water Act went into effect. He's rolled back regulations that keep factory farms from dumping massive amounts of untreated liquid animal waste directly into public waterways. In our oceans, he's... Excuse me, sneeze there. He's in our oceans, he's moved to allow drilling along the coasts. I mean, it just goes on and on. So, he's just lying through his teeth. Meanwhile, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and Earl Blumenauer held a press conference this morning. I'm guessing you probably didn't hear about this on the news either, asking for Congress to declare a climate emergency in the United States. So that's all going on. And then Ross Perot, he died at 89. Now, Ross Perot was he had a checkered past, shall we say. He was not kind to gay people. This was, when the AIDS epidemic was raging, and my recollection, one person called and actually mentioned this, and I don't have the details on it, but my recollection is that he was sort of in the Reagan camp of this is the gay disease kind of thing, and not understanding or just being a bigot, in that regard. But the thing that I thought was most consequential about Ross Perot's attempts in 1992 to challenge, and nearly successful attempts, to challenge both George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton had to do with trade. In 92, the Reagan administration had been working out a trade deal for a couple of years, the last couple of years of the Reagan administration. They initiated this thing to work out a trade deal with Canada and Mexico that would allow American corporations to send manufacturing jobs to Mexico. And the logic of this, the way that this was being sold to us by the Reagan administration and then by the Bush administration, was that by sending factories to Mexico, those are jobs that we really don't want here anymore anyway. They're dirty jobs, they're hard jobs. Let's let the Mexicans do those jobs, right? So we'll send the factory jobs down there. The factory jobs pay pretty well. I mean, in the United States, they were paying, $30, $40, $50 an hour in today's dollar equivalents. If they go to Mexico, maybe they'll pay $5 or $10 an hour. It turned out they only paid $1 an hour, but in any case, that these good manufacturing jobs in Mexico will create a Mexican middle class. That Mexican middle class will want to buy American products made in America, which will help other American manufacturing. So yeah, we're going to move our car production down there and maybe our washing machines, but all kinds of cool stuff that we build here will want, the Mexicans will want to buy. Didn't work out that way, but that was how it was almost entirely Republican efforts, starting with Nixon opening China to Pepsi-Cola and then, Reagan with NAFTA. But then the Democratic Party got on the bandwagon in 91, and with the creation of the Democratic Leadership Council that adopted free trade and said, we really, we're moving into the computer era. These are new white-collar jobs. And I think a lot of people bought this, and I think a lot of the people selling it were doing it with the best of intentions. They believed it to be true, that, we don't need manufacturing in this country anymore. We can just move to basically a service economy or a manufacturing light where we're manufacturing bits and bytes. We're doing software rather than hardware. So anyhow, Ross Perot said, no, if you move jobs down to Mexico without wage protections, without environmental protections, without, oversight. And at that time, Pre was running the government down there, which is notoriously corrupt. He said, if you do this, what's going to happen is this giant sucking sound from the South. It's going to destroy American jobs. And he debated both Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. Both of them agreed, yeah, NAFTA is a great thing, or will be a great thing if we pass it. Now, NAFTA they had finished the negotiations in the Bush administration. So this was George Herbert Walker Bush's NAFTA deal that then Bill Clinton signed and, made into law. But my recollection was Ross Perot disliked that strongly and campaigned against it. In fact, that was what motivated him to get into politics and run for president in 92 and then again in 96 against Bill Clinton. And this morning on TV, on the TV machine, and I don't know what networks you listen to. If you had a different experience, let me know. But what I heard on TV was that Ross Perot was campaigning in 92 against government debt. Now, maybe this is because the producers and the talent are all young enough that they literally don't remember the 92 election, and I'm old enough that I do. Or maybe it's that the networks really kind of like those free trade agreements and they don't want to talk about the fact that they're very unpopular. Or maybe it's that they think that, Trump now owns the anti-NAFTA vote and they don't want to help Trump. I don't know. But there's a lot of Democrats who are opposed to NAFTA and these trade deals, too. And a lot of them tragically voted for Donald Trump in the last election. I don't think they'll make that mistake again. But we'll see. And so anyway, this is with the goal of correcting the record, shall we say. The clip that I heard on MSNBC this morning started with Perot basically saying, basically it was, his giant sucking sound for the South, but they completely omitted the part about moving your jobs to Mexico. So here's the entire clip.
First thing you ought to do is get all these folks who've got these one-way trade agreements that we've negotiated over the years and say, fellas, we'll take the same deal we gave you. And they'll gridlock right at that point because, for example, we've got international competitors who simply could not unload their cars off the ships if they had to comply. You see, if it was a two-way street, just couldn't do it. We have got to stop sending jobs overseas. To those of you in the audience who are business people, pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25, that's assuming you've been in business for a long time, you've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
Yeah, there you go. The giant sucking sound going south. I even had that quote wrong. But it's like, are we reinventing history? Are we rewriting history? Seriously? Ross Perot was right on this, and my recollection is that he was right on this. So. Anyhow, we'll continue with that conversation. There's that conversation. There's just all kinds of stuff to talk about today. And what's going on with Trump. We started this conversation yesterday. Can you forgive family members who've turned into Trumpies if Trump is gone in 2020? And do you have family members who have changed, who have awakened? How do we do that? Jen, I think it was Pesco. Jen, the brainwashing of my father. That's an amazing movie of my dad, I guess.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And she talks about how once they got her dad off Fox News, and they did it by, the TV's broken, it doesn't get that channel anymore. Once they got him off Fox News, he turned into a rational human being. And welcome back. David in Woodland Hills, California. Hey, David, global warming, you wanted to get back to that?
You were talking about how it causes allergies to become worse, and it happened to me, and I know the natural, holistic, healthy cure.
Okay.
It's not actually a cure, it's a remedy because you have to keep doing it. And it's really simple and easy. It's locally harvested honey. This is for over-air allergies.
Oh, yeah. So if it's locally harvested, you're getting all the local pollens.
and it acts just like a vaccination. So
Right.
That's exactly right. It contains all the local pollens. You have to do it every 2 weeks, for 2 weeks, every allergy season. Allergy seasons are longer now, more frequent. Plants are moving up 200 miles that we were not previously exposed to if you live in the same place. So you have to do locally harvested honey, 2 teaspoons a day for 2 weeks, every allergy season. I went from sneezing hundreds of times a day, which I'd never done before, to sneezing 3 or 4, 5, 6 times a day.
Huh. That's interesting. My sneezing seems to be, yes, I'm sneezing, and I've never in my life, the only time I've ever sneezed in my life is if I saw a bright light, right? And that's because the optic nerve is right next to the sneeze nerve, and if you get overloaded on your optic nerve, and that's actually a hereditary thing. 23andMe pointed that out to me. But living here in Portland over the last couple of years, I have started sneezing. It seems to happen, though, when the air conditioning kicks on. Whenever the air conditioning in this building comes on, it starts getting colder. I start feeling colder. I just rolled down my sleeves because I'm feeling cold. My hands are like ice right now. But also, I think that maybe the air conditioning system is, the ducts are just full of pollen. And I'm not sure if it's blowing out cold air at me and making me sneeze, or if it's blowing out pollen and making me sneeze. So how do you find locally sourced honey, David?
You can do it from Whole Foods. You can do it from local farmers markets.
Yeah. That would be the place.
Any of the naturals, you can order it online. Just make sure it's local. And here's the other thing. If you do it the remedy and it doesn't work, then you know that it's not over-the-air pollens or over-the-air stuff that's doing it. It's something else.
Yeah, so it might be like dust mites or something that you're allergic to or whatever.
Or a food allergy, or a chemical allergy.
Yeah, interesting. Or just being cold. I really don't. It's again, this is something that is new to me, but because I've sneezed 5, 6 times now on the air and over the last couple of hours, and it's always, it's not a good thing to do, particularly when you're on television. But, yeah.
And this is one of the allergy seasons.
Is it really? I thought because the trees are not flowering right now. Why is it an allergy season?
They're more frequent and longer lasting. And it can also be, are there any fires near you?
No, not that I know of. They haven't started up yet. That'll happen in August.
So the thing is, if you do the honey and it doesn't work, then you know it's not from that.
Yeah, and the worst that'll happen is I had some good honey. So
2 teaspoons a day for 2 weeks every allergy season.
Okay, you got it. 2 teaspoons a day for 2 weeks. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. Dr. David, thank you for the input. We'll be right back. It's 21 minutes past the hour. By the way, just some other quick news here, and then I'll pick up your phone calls. The Ann Appeals Court, this is the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, today ruled that Donald Trump can't block Twitter users. Trump, no doubt, will appeal this to the Supreme Court. Then it's going to start getting interesting. And 4 in 10 Americans say they still struggle to pay their bills. That's no improvement since 2014. So the Trump economy sucks. 23% of workers, including nearly 2 in 10 of those over 50, don't expect to ever be able to stop working. A quarter of Americans say they will continue working beyond their 65th birthday, which I've done, but I'm doing it because, hey, I'm having a good time, not because I have to. And I get it that it's really a challenge for all these people that have to. So let's see here. Steve in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind?
Talk about Ross and stuff, but one time I sneezed almost 50 times in a row.
Oh, really? We were talking about sneezing a minute ago, too, in the allergy season. And the fellow who called said get locally grown honey or locally sourced honey, and it acts like a vaccine to stop against sneezing. But you wanted to talk about Ross Perot.
Right. I did. Well, I found out what it was. It was I had too much to drink.
Oh, okay. Well, don't do that again.
No, just not as much. One thing too, I hear from my lifelong buddy back in Madison every week. He's screaming, "It's raining every day back there," and that shows the climate. Their fronts aren't moving and stuff.
Yeah.
And thanks to these good contributors, Paul and in Washington, and Norma down in Alabama, and this last guy, we got too many to thank. But anyways, you were right on Ross. I remember that distinctly. He was so against the NAFTA and the giant sucking sound. And as far as the networks talking about the debt and all that stuff, corporations' main objective it's to make money,
Mm-hmm.
and for the CEOs, they're very highly paid, so much more obscene than they were before Reagan. And I think what's going on is they're all worried about a progressive or even a Democrat getting in because they want things to remain static. They don't want taxes changing or going up. Right. And they know if they get a progressive like Bernie in there or possibly Elizabeth, their taxes might get raised way up, like they should be, back up to the 91 percentile or at least the 74th. And they're talking about the debt thing. They're setting us up for the old Republican meme, which is brought to us by those goons, Wayrick or Atwater, where we got to shoot our own Santa Claus.
Yep.
And that's going to be Social Security or Medicare.
Yep.
And that's where I think part of this is going.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And Ross Perot was outspoken about that as well, although he did talk about the national debt somewhat. Yeah, thank you.
Lastly, I'd like to just say, again, FDR, we did it before, we can do it again. Bernie 2020.
Amen.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve. Or at least amen to FDR. Kathy in San Antonio. I mean, I like Bernie too, but I'm not endorsing anybody. Kathy in San Antonio, Texas. Hey, Kathy, what's up?
Hi, Tom. This is my first time calling.
Well, thank you.
I just wanted to share my experience of remembering Ross Perot when he was running for president.
Okay.
I do remember that he talked about the deficit. I remember him, he had the deficit clock a few times, and he was showing how our deficit was going up. And he did also run on trying to balance the budget.
Right.
I really liked him because he was a self-made millionaire or a billionaire, and he was very sort of down home, and he spoke really plainly. I especially liked the fact that he was against NAFTA, and he was really honest about the effect that it was going to have on American jobs, and he was the only politician that was talking about that. So yeah. I didn't vote for him, but I did appreciate his input.
Yeah, he got 19% of the vote. He nearly hit 20%. I mean, he had more people vote for him than any third-party candidate since Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party in 1912, as I recall.
Yeah.
I mean, that's huge. It was absolutely huge. And most of it was on the foundation that we shouldn't have stupid trade deals.
Right. He really did understand that from a very common sense point of view, how it would affect the American workers. And Bill Clinton and the other Republicans were talking about it with some pie-in-the-sky idea that it was just going to make everybody wealthier, and it didn't work out that way.
Yeah, it definitely didn't work out that way. I'm willing to believe that Bill Clinton had good intentions on this. I'm not sure I'm willing to believe that George Herbert Walker Bush did. But, we should learn from history. And Ross Perot was right. Kathy, at least about that. Kathy, thanks so much for the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with more of your calls and the news of the day. UNC researcher has good news for Democrats right after this. It's the Mueller report. This is we're starting with page 144 today. This is labeled post-election and transition period contacts. That would be contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Trump was elected president on November 8th, 2016. Beginning immediately after the election, individuals connected to the Russian government started contacting officials on the Trump campaign and transition team through multiple channels, sometimes through Russian Ambassador Kislyak and at other times through individuals who sought reliable contacts with U.S. persons not formally tied to the campaigners' transition team. The most senior levels of the Russian government encouraged these efforts. The transition did not establish that these efforts reflected or constituted coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia in its election interference activities. As soon as news broke that Trump had been elected president, Russian government officials and prominent Russian businessmen began trying to make inroads into the new administration. They appeared to not have pre-existing contacts and struggled to connect with senior officials around the president-elect. As explained below, those efforts entailed both official contacts through the Russian embassy in the United States and outreaches sanctioned at high levels of the Russian government through business rather than political contacts. A, page 145, A, outreach from the Russian government. At approximately 3 a.m. on election night, Trump campaign press secretary Hope Hicks received a telephone call on her personal cell phone from a person who sounded foreign but was calling from a number with a D.C. area code. Although Hicks had a hard time understanding the person, she could make out the words Putin call. Hicks told the caller to send her an email. The following morning, on November 9th, 2016, Sergei Kuznetsov, an official in the Russian embassy at the United States, emailed Hicks from his Gmail address with the subject line, "Message from Putin." Attached to the email was a message from Putin in both English and Russian, which Kuznetsov asked Hicks to convey to the president-elect. In the message, Putin offered his congratulations to Trump for his electoral victory, stating he looked forward to working with Trump on leading Russian-American relations out of crisis. Hicks forwarded the email to Kushner, asking, "Can you look into this? Don't want to get duped, but don't want to blow off Putin." Kushner stated in congressional testimony that he believed it would be possible to verify the authenticity of the forwarded email through the Russian ambassador, whom Kushner had previously met in April of 2016. Unable to recall the Russian ambassador's name, Kushner emailed Dmitry Simes of CNI, whom he had consulted previously about Russia, and asked, "What is the name of the Russian ambassador?" Kushner forwarded Simes's response, which identified Kislyak by name, to Hicks. After checking with Kushner to see what he had learned, Hicks conveyed Putin's letter to transition officials. 5 days later, on November 14, 2016, Trump and Putin spoke by phone in the presence of transition team members, including incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. B, high-level encouragement of contacts through alternative channels. As Russian officials in the United States reached out to the president-elect and his team, a number of Russian individuals working in the private sector began their own efforts to make contact. Peter Aven, a Russian national who heads Alfa Bank, Russia's largest commercial bank, described to the office interactions with Putin during this time period that might account for the flurry of Russian activity. Aven told the office that he is one of approximately 50 wealthy Russian businessmen who regularly meet with Putin in the Kremlin. These 50 are often referred to as the oligarchs. Aven told the office that he met on a quarterly basis with Putin, including in the fourth quarter of 2016, shortly after the U.S. presidential election. Aven said that he took these meetings seriously and understood that any suggestions or critiques that Putin made during these meetings were implicit directives and that there would be consequences for Aven if he did not follow through. As was typical, the 2016 fourth quarter meeting with Putin was preceded by a preparatory meeting with Putin's chief of staff, Anton Vaino. According to Aven, at his Q4 2016 one-on-one meeting with Putin, Putin raised the prospect that the United States would impose additional sanctions on Russian interests, including sanctions against Aven and/or Alfa Bank. Putin suggested that Aven needed to take steps to protect himself and Alfa Bank. Aven also testified that Putin spoke of the difficulty faced by the Russian government in getting in touch with the incoming Trump administration. According to Aven, Putin indicated that he did not know with whom formally to speak and generally did not know the people around the president-elect. Page 147. Aven, deleted by Bill Barr, told Putin that he would take steps to protect himself and the Alfa Bank shareholders from potential sanctions. And one of those steps would be to try to reach out to the incoming administration to establish a line of communication. Aven described Putin responding with skepticism about Aven's prospect for success. According to Aven, although Putin did not expressly direct him to reach out to the Trump transition team, Aven understood that Putin expected him to try to respond to the concerns he had raised. Aven's efforts are described in Volume 1. 2. Kirill Dmitriev's transition-era outreach to the incoming administration. Aven's description of his interactions with Putin is consistent with the behavior of Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian national who heads Russia's sovereign wealth fund and is closely connected to Putin. Dmitriev undertook efforts to meet members of the incoming Trump administration in the months after the election. Dmitriev asked a close business associate who worked for the United Arab Emirates Royal Court, George Nader, to introduce him to Trump transition officials, and Nader eventually arranged a meeting in the Seychelles between Dmitriev and Eric Prince, a Trump campaign supporter and an associate of Steve Bannon. It's the Mueller Report.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. And Michael in Columbus, Ohio. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
I hope to talk to Dr. Mann about climate crisis. He mentioned, and I think you discussed briefly, the idea of planting trees all over the world. But
I mentioned that.
Okay, but that was probably not realistic.
That's what he said.
Yeah, often about move to amend and the elimination of corporate constitutional rights and money is speech. To me, that seems to be the systemic change that would allow actual reasonable regulations and laws to be passed that would allow us to reduce emissions. And I wanted to ask if in all the discussions you've had over the years about how we can address the climate crisis, have you heard of any systemic change other than this amendment that would allow things to actually change?
I think you're absolutely right, Michael. The original sin here in politics is Buckley versus Vallejo, the 1976 decision of the Supreme Court after Lewis Powell was put on the court that said that basically when a corporation or a billionaire throws money into a political campaign, throws money behind a ballot initiative, throws money behind a politician, buys a politician, essentially owns a politician or even an entire political party, that is constitutionally protected First Amendment free speech, not the spending of money, which is completely counterintuitive and completely BS. And then they doubled down on it, of course, in 2010, October 2010, with the Citizens United decision. And this not only is allowing big fossil fuel interests to control our debate and dialogue and discussion and legislation around climate change, it's also allowing the big banks to regulate or control basically our discussion about whether big banks should be broken up. And what new regulations they're trying to put on credit unions and locally owned banks to make them community banks to make them less competitive against the big banks. It's the thing that is allowing the big insurance companies to own our healthcare dialogue and debate, allowing big pharma to own our pharmaceutical landscape. I mean, pick an industry, right? It's allowing 4 airlines to monopolize prices, jam us into smaller and smaller seats with crummier service and make flying a miserable experience. And while they're laughing all the way to the bank. I mean, just literally pick an industry. Every single one of these industries has become more toxic to us with the help of government, by virtue of their ability to spend money and thus influence politics because of the Buckley decision and the Citizens United decision. This is not how politics were prior to 1980, basically, which is when the Buckley decision really started to sink in and the Republicans figured out, hey, our rich buddies can own any politician they want.
Yeah, but Tom, I know you know that aside from the money, just having constitutional rights allows a corporation to ensure winning just about any court case they take up, because they can find, even if it's twisted, an amendment that applies to them for what they want to gain. And right now, we're all scared about this climate crisis and the fact that it seems to be existential. And yet, only one of our presidential candidates so far has come out and said what we have to do is get rid of corporate constitutional rights and money is speech, and that was Mayor Pete. Governor Inslee is talking about changing climate or reducing climate change, but no one yet that I've heard has come out in public, aside from Jayapal.
Well, Bernie has made that point on this program probably 100 times over the 11 years that he was on this show.
About money or constitutional rights?
Both.
I know money all the time.
Both. Bernie has repeatedly spoken out against the so-called 1886 Santa Clara decision.
Right.
So
why don't
against
he and
Buckley.
others then actually use this as part of their campaign?
I think they may well be, and I believe that Elizabeth Warren is as well. It is, though. I agree with you, Michael. I think this is a cornerstone issue. And we should be viewing it as somewhat of a litmus test. And I would love to know the position of every single one of the Democratic candidates on it. And with that, Michael, I gotta move along and let somebody else in here to talk. But thank you for the call. It's an important topic. It really, really is. So David in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Hey, David, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I wanted to remind you, one of the ways Mr. Perot made his billions was he owned a company called EDS, Electronic Data Systems.
Right.
And he managed to get an ironclad contract with the United States government to supply, at the time it was 286s and 386 computers to the IRS, to the FBI. Which, if you remember, that for like over a decade, nobody could upgrade their computers. They were stuck in this ironclad agreement with EDS. And one of the other things that he did was he was notorious about having detective private eyes watch his employees, who they rendezvoused with, if they had a tryst at somebody's motel room, which would get them fired, if they smoked, if they drank.
Yeah.
And I want to also mention, as far as one of the impetus that they used as far as sending our manufacturing overseas, I remember very well, and Gingrich was one of these people that did it, was holding up Toffler's Third Wave. God help me, I read that thing.
Yeah,
but
Alvin Toffler's book, yeah.
Toffler didn't say that the Third Wave was supplementing industry, in fact, which was the second wave, that in fact it was a pyramid. You had to have the first wave agriculture, which supported the second wave industry, which supported the third wave, which was the knowledge worker.
Right.
But they took that completely out of context and said, this is why we don't need manufacturing jobs anywhere. We're all going to become knowledge workers.
You're right. Yeah, and not only was Newt Gingrich making that sales pitch, but the Democratic Party did for a long time. And I think that, in fact, I would say right up through Obama making that pitch essentially for the Pacific deal, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Toffler never said that. That was not what Toffler
I know. I read Toffler's book, too, that was in the 80s, wasn't it?
Help us both, because that was a tough read.
Yeah. Well, I can't say I read the entire book, actually, but I had Toffler's book. I mean, I think everybody had Toffler's book. It was a major,
Future Shock was his first one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. Future Shock. I had both books. Future Shock, I think I actually read. But it's been
it was easier.
It's been a long time.
Academic.
Yeah, there you go. David, thanks for pointing that out and for pointing out that nobody, a lot of people have clay feet. Not there's nobody perfect out there, and in many ways Ross Perot wasn't a good guy, but he did get it right on trade, and that was my point. And I think that they're trying to whitewash that, frankly, and it concerns me. Jules in Eugene, Oregon. Hey, oops. Got to push the right button here. Jules, thank you thanks for listening. What's up?
I've listened to your show for years and am a donor for years.
Well, thank you. You mean to Free Speech TV?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
And
thank you.
I want to thank you. And the topic that I wanted to bring up is that with the refugee crisis in the three countries where their economy is messed up because of the environment, would it be cheaper to just help those countries rebuild than deal with the refugee problem? And is there anybody talking about that in the legislature?
Yeah, I think it would be cheaper, and even if it was slightly more expensive, it's a permanent long-term fix as opposed to these short-term deal with the crisis. It's dealing with the problem rather than the effects of the problem, and therefore we should be doing it. And these countries that have largely agricultural-based economies, they're going to have to figure out. Now the energy and Jules, thank you for the call. I was thinking about this yesterday when I was walking home from the studio. Energy is at the core of everything, right? I mean, literally, the production of food comes about in the efficiency of the production of food is a function of energy. We used to plant crops by hand. Then we used animals. We used oxen, to plow our fields. And then we replaced oxen with internal combustion engines. That you could have, or horses were replaced by internal combustion engines. So you could have the power of 100 horses inside a tractor instead of having to pull 100 horses. And so we became much more productive, right, agriculturally. Now, if you look at these Central American countries, all the sunshine that they get, if they had, and also they're right between two oceans, so there's, constant wind. If they were to generate massive amounts of electricity using solar and wind power in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, in these Central American countries, if they were to generate massive amounts of electricity, they could use that electricity to power things like giant greenhouses, power the water systems for irrigation, power the heat and air conditioning regulation of those greenhouses, so that they could produce enormous amounts of food like they're producing right now, only much more efficiently, as increasingly large parts of their land become basically, because of drought and because of flooding, become basically so screwed up that they won't support agriculture. So it's a way that they could, make it through, that they could survive. But, nobody's even talking about this. I think it just seems to me like a good idea. Anyhow, Charlene in Mesa, Arizona. Hey, Charlene, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, you were talking about Russ Perot saying the sucking sound of the jobs leaving.
Right.
Well, Chevrolet builds a lot of their cars in Mexico. I have a track that was built in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Sunday night, New York Times has a half-hour show on FX and also on Hulu called The Weekly.
Right.
And they did an episode about Chevy shutting down the Cruise factory in Lordstown, Ohio, and how it impacted the citizens there. And it was so sad. They talked to a man. He worked for GM. His dad worked for GM, and they're being offered to take jobs elsewhere within the company and relocate. But like this man has a daughter with cerebral palsy. She's 13. And if they left Ohio, they'd have to reapply for all the assistance, the Medicaid and all of that, and have a wait. I mean, it's really sad. So there you go, Ross Perot and sucking sound.
Yeah, and Ross Perot was right again, at least with regard to trade. Amen. Thank you, Charlene.
Okay.
Thanks for putting a human face on that story. I appreciate the call. We'll be right back. It's coming up. It's 45 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a few minutes. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. We've got, so much on the stack here. We'll get back to all these issues right after this. And don't forget, we have a free podcast now on iTunes and wherever else you may get your podcasts.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We have the 3-hour podcast that you can subscribe to over at thomhartmann.com, and then there's the free 1-hour podcast. It's advertising supported that is pretty much everywhere. Check it out. And welcome back. Terry in Seattle, listening on KBCS. Hey, Terry, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Hey, thanks for visiting us here in Seattle. I was in the audience a couple of weeks ago, and that sea of gray out there. Just as a side note, I don't know why there weren't more young people in the audience, since the topic was guns leading to gun control.
Yeah, I think the audience probably reflected the listenership to the program, and my experience working in radio back in the 60s and 70s, and then again the last 15 years, is that people tend to want to listen to people their own age, more or less, or at least they're generationally, and so yeah, we pull in some young people, but this show does a much better job of pulling in boomers because I'm one, and I think it's just that simple.
I'm talking about the talk you had at the town hall.
Yeah, no, this is an issue that young people are really, really concerned about, but they probably didn't know I was there because they weren't listening to the radio station.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, that may explain it. But getting to the topic I wanted to talk about here, as far as Ross Perot, I'm sure he was a good man. Tom, we are all victims of our own contradictions, and nobody's perfect out there, and I'm certainly not. Ross Perot, I think, was dead on right with NAFTA.
Yeah.
I think most of us would agree with that. However, he was a very wealthy man. He did things to keep his wealth, including parking a large amount of his wealth in tax-free municipal bonds, which he held in several states. And these are tax-free. It's a vehicle that the wealthy use to hang on.
Well, not just the wealthy. Average people can. I mean, what you're doing is you're basically loaning money to your local city and getting a lower interest rate return than you would get from other kinds of bonds, particularly corporate bonds. But in exchange for that lower rate of return, you're getting a tax deduction or a tax deduction. And it seems like a good thing to me. I mean, this is how cities can raise money without paying huge amounts of interest.
Well, yeah, but
what's bad about that?
My impression is it's primarily used for people who do have more money.
Well, the people who have the best, if you have a high income, if you're paying 30, 40, 50% income tax rate, and you're looking for income that's not taxed, municipal bonds can provide you income that is tax-free, which is extraordinary if you're paying half your income in taxes. On the other hand, if you're only paying 10 or 20% of your income on taxes, if you're making under $50,000 a year or $30,000 a year under that, then why bother with a municipal bond? Go for a bond that has a higher yield if you're looking for a place to park some money.
I'm sure his motivation, though, was to hold on to
Of course it was. Of course it was. But I can't fault that. I mean, I'd be much more upset with people like Donald Trump who put their money overseas.
Yeah, but I mean that gets back to the whole issue of if the wealthy don't pay the taxes, the rest of us have to. Okay,
right.
Somebody has to.
Right.
And in spite of his positions, his egalitarian positions on many other issues, on this one, well, not so much.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if Ross Perot was putting money in offshore banks like Trump has done, like the Kushners have done, like a lot of the very wealthy Republicans have done. But I got no problem with people buying municipal bonds. But I get your point, Terry. I get your point. Thank you very much for the call. Thanks for listening to KBCS. We'll be right back. So this whole thing with Jeffrey Epstein is getting very interesting. Yesterday, the news was Bill Barr has recused himself because he once worked at a law firm that once defended Jeffrey Epstein, even though he had nothing to do with it. And that's not really a good reason to recuse yourself. And I was thinking, when Trump finds out that his guy, Bill Barr, has recused himself from the Epstein investigation, if Donald Trump, who was good friends with Epstein, however you say his name, and in fact is on the record from 2002 saying that he knew that Epstein liked younger girls, in quotes. If Trump was one of the people who took a trip on the Lolita Express, apparently the name of Jeffrey Epstein's private plane, or one of his private jets, if Donald Trump, the two of them they were neighbors in Palm Beach, in Florida, by Mar-a-Lago. If Epstein and Trump were both exploiting these young women, then Donald Trump would have a real interest in keeping the investigation into Alex Acosta, Costa, however, I'm mixing him up or using Alexandria, and it's different people, who's our Commerce Secretary, using him, or our Labor Secretary, excuse me, using, if Acosta is in the position he's in because he let Epstein off and because he didn't prosecute Epstein's co-conspirators or the other men who were exploiting these girls, and one of those men happened to be Donald Trump, the thought went through my mind yesterday, Bill Barr just made a huge mistake by recusing himself because Trump is going to want him to be there to cover his backside, to protect him. And now I'm reading that Bill Barr has come out and said, I'm recused on the investigations that had to do with Florida back in 2000, whatever it was, but I'm not recused on this stuff right now. I can oversee the prosecution in New York, the guy who works there, the prosecutor, I'm his boss, and I can limit investigations. I can do whatever I want. So Bill Barr has now unrecused himself. Surprise, surprise. I think he's covering up for Trump. I really do. We'll see where it goes. James in Lindale, what's EX?
Yeah, I want to say the thing about...
What state are you in, James?
Texas.
Oh, Texas. It should be TX.
Right.
Anyhow, what's up?
You're saying about having liability insurance because you own a gun?
Yeah.
Well, criminals aren't going to do it. So why are you making it harder, and why would you make it more expensive to own it? I mean, and then you just got to say it in your report that people are still flat, especially black people are still really, really flat. And then you want to tax a constitutional right. That doesn't make any sense to me because criminals aren't going to abide by it.
My daughter had her car stolen the other day by a car thief. And it's an older car, and, he was able to break in with a screwdriver and basically turn it on and drive himself across town and then dropped it off, oddly enough. Criminals tend not to buy liability insurance. You're absolutely right. Are you suggesting that we should no longer have liability insurance for cars? Because we have that because cars can kill people.
Right now, we're not talking about cars.
Okay.
We're talking about a constitutional right.
Actually, the Constitution mentions roads. You have a constitutional right to drive a car.
No, not really. No, not really. Because you're driving.
Article 1, Section 8.
Your driving privileges can be taken away from you.
And your gun ownership privilege can be taken away from you. Your free speech privilege can be taken away from you.
Not for not having insurance.
Yeah.
It's in the house. If it's in the house or if it's on my person, right? You're telling me you want me to pay an extra tax for exercising.
It's not a tax. It's liability insurance. And yes, I'm saying that I want you to have liability insurance for your gun. Because if your gun kills somebody, and if you have a gun in your home, the odds are 500% higher that it will kill somebody in your home who is not a bad guy. It will kill you or a family member or a friend in your home. And if that happens, you don't want to have your entire life ruined because you've now got a lawsuit that's going to wipe you out. And B, that person's family at the very least should be made whole. Kenneth in Seattle. Hey, Kenneth, we've got about a little more than a minute here to the end of the show. What's up?
Yeah, I'll try to crowd in. Regarding proposed forgiveness of those family members who were in the Trump camp, I think forgiveness is irrelevant because forgiveness applies when someone turns away from the errors of his way. But when they double down, that's ridiculous. Also, there was a saying I heard when I was a teenager, if you educate a fool, what you get is an educated fool. I have two nieces with PhDs, and they are actually Trumpites. Now, of course, I still advocate high education. Yes. I'm a latter-day New Dealer. Yes, all that, but it's not proof against educated fools. So.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't have more. But
no, that's good. That's good. It's a tough one. So okay. Thank you very much for that, Kenneth. And I think that this is a really good question, and we'll probably continue talking about it throughout the week. And Thursday and Friday, by the way, I'll be doing this show live from Netroots Nation in Philadelphia. If you're going to be there, drop by the Free Speech TV booth and say hi. But I think it's really a good question is, what do we do with people after Trump leaves office who are big Trump supporters? If they continue to be Trump supporters, because Trump is going to continue to pound his chest and talk to anybody who will listen. That's what he does. Or what do you do with people who actually figured out that they've been scammed by him? I guess that's probably less of a question because those people, it's fairly obvious. You embrace them. You bring them back into the family, I think. Anyhow, we'll continue this conversation and much more tomorrow, same time, same place. And in the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It isn't something we just sit around and watch on TV. It only works. Democracy literally only works in a Republican government, in a republic, if you get involved. So get out there, get active, tag. You're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.